So welcome everyone. Public Works Advisory Board here. And before we begin, I was going to clarify or ask for clarification. I've seen this referred to as a special meeting and also as a regular meeting. And we do have several different topics on the agenda. So it's not only the intersection topic. So why don't we just start with that clarification and then the roll call?
Chair Beal, thank you for the opportunity to clarify that. It's true, at the last meeting, at the end of the meeting, I did say that this would be a special meeting. I misspoke. I was under the impression that if the location changed, it would have to be a special meeting. Our city clerk did clarify that that's not the case. The only time you need a special meeting is if the time or date is changed, and that hasn't changed for this meeting. So this is in fact a regular meeting of the PWEP.
Okay, well, we're calling that meeting to order, and if you'd like to go ahead with the roll call.
Thank you. Advisory Board Member Ingrafia.
Present too.
Advisory Board Member, yeah, as we stare each other in the eyes. Advisory Board Member Irwin.
Present.
Advisory Board Member Goldman.
Here.
Advisory Board Member Nava.
Here.
Advisory Board Member, and why can't I remember your last name? Gaffney, thank you, apologies.
Here.
Only been working 2 years. And Advisory Board Member Rogers is not here. And Chair Beal.
Present.
We have quorum.
Thank you. We would like to start our meeting with a moment of silence. Thank you. Thank you all for observing that moment. And then before we actually commence, we will start with the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll ask if one of our board members would kindly volunteer to lead us. I think we can proceed. I'm sure that no matter what direction you're looking in, there will be a flag. Next on the agenda, are there any announcements, either from any board members or from staff?
Thank you, Chair Beal. We do have one announcement about our Arbor Day activities. I'd ask Public Works staff member Derek Hansen to come up and give a brief presentation about what we did for Arbor Day this year.
Hello? Oh, I think that's working as well. Thank you. Hello, my name is Derek Hansen. I'm an engineering technician in Public Works, and I am also the organizer of this and last year's Arbor Day event. How can I advance the slides? Is there a way to? Next slide. I understand we have a couple of important topics to be discussing today, so I will be keeping this comparatively brief. On April 22nd, Earth Day this year, the City of Morro Bay participated and hosted an Arbor Day event in which we planted 5 strawberry madrones near the intersection of Morro Avenue and Pacific Street. The city does this event every year to be recertified as a Tree City USA with the Arbor Day Foundation as part of our efforts to the installation and preservation of trees within our city. This event this year we were joined by Morro Bay in Bloom and Morro Bay Beautiful, who participated in last year's Arbor Day event at Lila Kaiser. And in addition, as part of their own Earth Day events, our local Girl Scout brownie troop, they got hands-on experience on what it takes to establish a tree within the city of Morro Bay. Next slide. Strawberry madrones were the species of tree chosen for a number of qualities. They are a hardy species with low water requirements, meaning that once they are established in a few years, they will be with the city for many more to come. Additionally, they thrive in sandy environments and are resistant to salty air, which means that they do well within specific conditions for the city of Morro Bay. As evergreens, their leaves will stay on throughout the winter, but they also produce flowers and fruit, which will support our local wildlife. One notable consideration for the strawberry madrones, due to the placement of them around and adjacent to sidewalks, is that the madrones have gentle roots. They are very unlikely to cause any damage to the sidewalks anytime in the future. And as an extra precaution, we have also installed root barriers around them to make sure that is the case. These trees were planted next to sidewalks so that they can be seen and enjoyed by the citizens of Morro Bay and any visitors for years to come. That is all.
Thank you, Derek. That's all the announcements we have on. Oh, wait a minute. Almost forgot. I think Damaris is still here. We do have new tour dates for the wharf. Those were posted on our website and on social media. I believe the first day is already sold out. Is Damaris here? Did she bounce out for a minute? No, she's not here. So we have a high interest in that. If we continue to see a high interest in those wharf tours, we'll continue to put them on. It's something we're very excited about. Other than that, no announcements from staff.
Any other announcements from board members? Okay, seeing none, we can move on with our agenda. Our first opportunity is public comment, but this is only if you have a comment on a matter that is not already included in the agenda. So if you've come to comment on the intersection, you can hold off for that. Anyone here to comment on something not in the agenda, please step forward.
Chair, and I'll just add that we do have a couple of students who can't stay for an item and would like to use the opportunity during this public comment session to make comments about an item, so that they will be coming up.
My name is Betty Winholtz. I'm a resident of Morro Bay, and I have to leave because I'm going to go tutor. So I'm going to make my comment now about the intersection at Highway 41 in Maine. And my comment is that I very much appreciated the workshop that we had last week or the week before over in the community center. It was very well attended and there were lots of good comments. I appreciated the format where we had interaction with staff and Caltrans and the consultant. My takeaway from that is that the signalization is still, for me, the preference. I'm not convinced that there's safety involved with the roundabout. And that's my prime thing. And for those of you who weren't here about 15 years ago, the light out at Yerba Buena, the residents out there had been asking for several years to put a light there because of the back and forth of people on the east side of the highway trying to get to the beach, and Caltrans would not do that. And finally, when a little boy 6 years old was hit by a car, they agreed to put it in. So I don't think we need to go through that. I think that we, from the get-go, can put in a good intersection and not lose any of our students, because not even one is worth that. And so that's my primary reason. My secondary reason, and it was talked about not in your staff report, but at the meeting, that the cost of the signalization is around $4 million. and that the cost of the roundabout is $12 million. And so I think we're really close to having that 4 million, and that's something we can do right away. It takes less time to put it in, whereas the other requires more time and is 3 times as expensive. So those are my arguments for you giving that kind of recommendation to the city council. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have other public comment during this open period? It looks like we have no additional comment. Do we have anyone who would like to provide virtual comments? Okay. In that case, we can proceed. Our next item is approval of the meeting minutes from the last meeting. That's agenda item A1. I have one question about the meeting minutes. As you know, we recently have done some switching around. We have a new chair and vice chair, and I'm not aware of when that officially takes effect and should be reflected in the meeting minutes. So I think that that's probably a question.
Janine, do we have an answer to that question?
Once the vote is taken, once the vote is taken, we can make that correction. So that's a non-substantive one that we can make now and not have to bring the minutes back.
I think we did. Are you saying that we can make the change because it belongs in the minutes and it's not in the minutes?
Correct,
Okay, so we can make that change
correct,
without a vote.
correct.
Okay.
It's noted that that is a correction, so.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to check because I wasn't sure if there was like an official date and whether that had happened or not. Okay. Would anyone like to provide any public comment on our motion, assuming there will be one, to approve the agenda from last month's meeting? Okay, is there a motion?
I move that we approve the agenda with the corrections noted.
I'll second that.
Any discussion? Seeing none, I think we can go ahead with a vote.
Board Member Ingraffia,
Yes, I approve.
Board Member Irwin,
Yes,
Board Member Goldman,
I was not here. Do I still vote?
you can abstain.
Okay, I'll abstain.
Board Member
Um,
Gaffney,
Yes.
Board Member Nava,
Yes.
Board Member Beal.
Yes, thank you.
Motion passes.
Different button. I think that brings us to I think what's the heart of the agenda, I would probably say. Item A2 has 2 alternatives to consider for the 41 Main Street intersection. Do we have a staff presentation? And I very much hope we do.
We certainly do. Thank you, Chair Beal. Before I begin, I would be remiss if we did not thank the high school for letting us have this meeting here and for hosting this meeting. Their staff set everything up. AGP also stepped up and brought in some mobile equipment, which was great. So thank you for that. This is a pretty amazing space, and it's really important for us to have this meeting here because we recognize the high school, the parents, the students, the staff are amongst the biggest stakeholders for this community decision. Janine, if you could pull up the presentation. I'll jump right into it. We do have, while we're waiting, John Rogers, who's our project manager from the consulting firm GHD. He'll be providing part of this presentation. Emily Creel is also here from GHD. She works on the environmental side. She'll be presenting one slide. I also want to acknowledge that a representative from SlowCog is in the room. They have some investments in this project one way or another, and I haven't seen anyone from Caltrans. Oh, yes. Hey, that's Mr. Irwin from Caltrans is in the room as well. Part of this project is on Caltrans right away. All of these folks will be available to answer any questions. So we can jump right in the presentation. Janine, next slide. Thank you. So the purpose of this agenda item, we're going to present the project status. We're going to discuss alternatives, understand our community's concerns, understand PWAB's concerns, and answer PWAB questions. Next slide. Tonight's goal is for the PWAB to review alternatives for this intersection, for staff to receive PWAB input, and then ultimately for PWAB to make a recommendation on a preferred alternative to City Council, who will be seeing this item as planned on June 13th. Next slide. Tonight's format, first we'll do a brief intro and project status. I'm providing part of that. John will provide another part. Then we'll do a full presentation from GHD that will be an evaluation of the pros and cons of each alternative. We're actually looking at 3 alternatives. One alternative is the roundabout. The other is a double signal alternative, and then also the no build alternative, which is the existing 5-way stop. And then we will have deliberation and vote by PWAB. Next slide. I want to share with the PWAB and the audience the public engagement that we've done over the past couple of weeks. So we did meet with the Student Senate in this room on May 2nd. We had a community meeting that was acknowledged in a public comment earlier at the Morro Bay Community Center last week on May 10th. We're doing a survey for Morro Bay High School stakeholders. That includes parents, staff, and students throughout May. That's posted every Friday on the high school's newsletter online. We have a community survey that we did a soft launch of at the community meeting. So if you were at the community meeting at the 10th, you already have the link to it. We just posted it today to our website, and we'll be looking at that through June 6th. That's the deadline to complete that survey. Then we have this meeting, and ultimately we'll be taking this item to the City Council as planned on June 13th. Next slide. Would like to talk about staff's role. This question has come up a lot in the public, and I want to make some clarifications. We see our number one role is to engage the public on this matter. We want to understand the concerns of the community. It is our duty, I feel, to remain neutral, but to answer questions honestly. We have an obligation to provide the PWAB and the City Council and the community with good information of anything that we're looking at. Even if it's popular or unpopular, it doesn't matter. That's what our job is. And then ultimately, whatever the decision that the City Council makes, it is our job to implement that. And we will do that enthusiastically, as with anything else. So next slide. So far, we have seen in this process a high level of community engagement. We've seen many vocal opponents and proponents of a roundabout alternative. Likewise, many vocal opponents and proponents of a double signal alternative. We have seen just generally a consensus to do something at the intersection. Certainly there are some who don't feel we need to, but generally that does seem to be the consensus. And the 3 main concerns and takeaways that we have heard, particularly at the community meeting, but also in other formats, including emails to the PWAB today, coming up to this meeting, is pedestrian safety is number 1, particularly for the high school students, the cost of the project, and traffic congestion and potential relief. Next slide. And what staff is seeing on the engineering and data side is the roundabout is a superior alternative to address congestion. A double signal is cheaper in the short term, not so much in the long term. We'll talk about that later in the presentation. And generally, a roundabout is safer for pedestrians, so it's not always perceived to be so. But there are other things to consider, and I want to be upfront about that. When this goes to City Council or as the PWAB is considering this, there are other issues at stake. One of them is upfront cost. One is public opinion. But still, it's our duty to tell the truth about what the engineering and the data show. And so we'll do that tonight. We also have surveys that will be considered by the City Council. We're not presenting them tonight because they're still in progress. I'll just share generally that the surveys we're seeing, we did get a peek at the results. They're pretty even. It's kind of like a neck and neck thing. The surveys are not a referendum or some kind of official vote, but certainly the city council will take those into consideration when they look at which alternative to implement. And it's pretty clear that this community is split on this issue when it comes to either a double signal or a roundabout. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to John Rogers. Can you go to the next slide? Just make sure I don't have another slide. Yep. Okay, I'll hand it off to John Rogers, who'll talk about the project background, history, and do an evaluation of all these alternatives.
All right. Thank you. So I'm John Rogers. I moved here in 1986. I've been a resident for a long time, graduated at Morro Bay High, and my daughter's at basketball practice right now. So this is fun for me. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you guys tonight about the project. It's meaningful to me. I rode through there as a high school student, and it's definitely important to deal with. The project has been around for a long time. Caltrans initiated a study in 2001. They looked at 2 alternatives. Those alternatives are still in our project. And they did a draft project report in 2002. CEQA was started, and then everything was put on hold in 2003. So it's been around for a long time. Next slide, please. CEQA is environmental, by the way. In 2013, Caltrans adopted a new policy. It's called the ICE evaluation process. They're here if we have specific questions regarding that. But that was completed in December of 2014 with 2 alternatives. Caltrans has agreed a new PSR is not needed. It was completed in the past. And the second step of this process evaluated the traffic flow and safety measures and did recommend that a roundabout was a preferred alternative. So we're still receiving community input for that. And cost and pedestrian safety are important too. But the ICE does look at all of those items and did recommend the roundabout. Next slide, please. This is the summary table at the back of the ICE step 2. Evaluates all the criteria that you can measure. And we counted up the score, and the roundabout does perform slightly better than the signal in the overall criteria. There's pros and cons for each alternative, which we will get into. Next slide, please. So the current project status is we're in the environmental process. So we've looked at potential impacts for both alternatives, one of which was a cultural resource that we'll talk about later. Environmental studies have been initiated. And at this point, we're looking at the green items for progress. So looking forward, we need to select an alternative to proceed with the environmental document. Caltrans is involved, and they will review and improve the environmental document. Caltrans will then give us the authority to move forward with design once we select an alternative, and that's the final step. Next slide, please. And Emily from SWCA, is that a good spot? I think that, yeah, go ahead and discuss the cultural and environmental status, please.
Hi, am I on here?
Mm.
Oops. Thank you for having me. My name is Emily Creel. I'm with SWCA Environmental Consultants. We're an environmental consulting firm based in San Luis Obispo, our local office, and I've been there for almost 14 years. So pretty long history working with the city. So appreciate being here and meeting y'all. Like John mentioned, we've been in the environmental review process for a while and we're still in it. So I kind of wanted to present two brief slides on what we've been doing and where we're going. What we've been doing is on this one item on this slide, which is cultural resources analysis. Like John mentioned, we did initiate environmental studies in 2018, but we realized very early on what we already knew, which was this was really going to be all about cultural resources. The project area encompasses a portion of one of, I believe, only 2 nationally registered prehistoric archaeology sites in our county. So it's a very significant resource, a very important resource. The site is also heavily disturbed, as you can imagine, with the roadways going in. And so it's a complicated resource to analyze from an environmental perspective and from a regulatory perspective. So the city is somewhat familiar with this resource and the processes because you've dealt with it recently on your sewer project. But we have a little bit of an additional level of oversight here because of the Caltrans process. So I've simplified what we've been working through on this slide, which is first you have to identify the resource. Second, you have to evaluate the project's impacts on it. We've done those things. And next, we're looking at mitigation options. We have determined that regardless of the alternative, there's no way to avoid that resource entirely. So we've worked extensively with John and the city staff on, redesign, different foundations, different alignments. We can't avoid it. And so we've finally gotten over this hump of knowing where that evaluation needs to go for cultural resources and the documentation we have to provide to document that we will adversely affect that resource in that site. So again, moving forward with cultural, we have to document our results, and those will have to go through a review process with both the state and the federal government because it is a state and nationally significant site. Next slide, please. So that's what we've been working on for a long time. Now that we're kind of over that hump, we're here to receive feedback from the community, from your board, from the city council. And then, assuming there's a clear path forward and direction forward, this is where we're going with environmental, which is basically to reinitiate and re-engage all the reports that were started in 2018, which we kind of just put the brakes on, knowing that this cultural issue was going to be the main one because these reports do become outdated. So we're ready to re-engage on these. You can see there's a whole lot of reports here. I want to just point to a few. One, hydrology and floodplain we're going to look at. Seems more critical now than it was in 2018, given the recent storms. And then the second, probably more than half of that list on the right side of your slide is that cultural piece. So that's the Section 106 compliance and the 4 very technical documents that we're preparing on that one. Our scope also includes preparation of an environmental document to satisfy CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, as well as NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And I will just say that it's a bit unusual for a project like this to require an EA for NEPA. And the EA stands for Environmental Assessment. It's kind of an M&D equivalent. There's a bigger NEPA document, more akin to an EIR, if y'all are familiar with that. But most of these projects in the NEPA world, projects like this would be exempted. It was that cultural piece that didn't allow us to use an exemption on the NEPA side. So we will be preparing a comprehensive CEQA analysis and NEPA analysis. I think that's all we had on environmental, but of course, here for questions.
What sort of modifications to the preliminary plans were there made? You were saying foundations for what, retaining walls?
That was one of them for sure. I don't know, John, you might be able to speak more specifically to engineering modifications.
We looked at all, because the cultural became so critical to the project, we look at all opportunities to avoid an impact to the cultural resource, which basically is, I think, within 2 feet below the pavement. So anything that we'd have to put in more than 2 feet deep would be an impact to this resource. The items that we really couldn't get away from were streetlights and storm drains. So we've concluded that there really is going to be an impact, and some of the pavement, especially on the signal, there's more road widening on the signal, so there'll be more pavement work, and you can't just pave existing pavement for future loads. You have to remove it and recompact the dirt, ending up with impacts to this resource. So
what happens, say, for the overpass fill material if we disturb that and we come across cultural material previously? Do we have to worry about that?
I'll defer to Emily on that, but there's mitigation requirements for any time you come across those resources.
Yeah, that's really the reason for the year's worth of work we've done to date, is to avoid that scenario. This site is very complicated from an analysis perspective because of that disturbance. And so what we discovered, we did a really extensive, what's called an extended phase 1 survey, and we coordinated with the tribes on what exactly the scope of that survey should be. But we closed off the roads to traffic. We dug holes in various locations, and we found some of the areas of the site to be very disturbed and probably didn't retain that integrity that would make the resource significant, but other areas were very intact. So we did the best job we could, given the extent of paving across our project area, to really define where that disturbance exists, the depth of it, the horizontal extent of it. And then you get to a point where you say, like, this is as good as we can understand at this point. We need to move to the next step. And we, coordinated with regulatory agencies and the tribes to get over that hurdle. But there is still always this possibility that you will find something when you're doing the actual construction. So I think we know enough about the site to understand what we could potentially find, but we don't know exactly where that may exist. And so these documents, if approved, will outline that plan for what you do in the event that occurs.
I was curious, so you start putting in a retaining wall to make room for some of these ramps which you're planning on. And you discovered within the fill material of the overpass. You find something, do you have to do anything special with any discovered cultural material previously disturbed and used for fill?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and the best example of that is any human remains, which are known to have been found along the 101 the 41 in this area. So that is, even in a disturbed setting, that is significant. And so you basically have to stop work, deal with the resource, engage the tribes, and figure out a path forward.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. You were talking about the cultural resources and you can't go deeper than 2 feet. Is that what you said? You couldn't dig deeper than 2 feet without disturbing things?
Well, that was the rule of thumb that I've heard when we've dealt
So-
with this. Yeah.
So then you were talking about even if you put in the signals, you have to make the road wider and you would have to, how deep do you dig for the signals?
So both alternatives have features that go deeper than 2 feet. For the signalized alternative, I believe it's primarily the lights. John, please correct me if I'm wrong. For the roundabout alternative, I believe it's more the retaining walls.
Okay.
So both alternatives were determined to go to a depth where you could encounter those intact resources.
Okay.
The depth of disturbed resources, which generally don't have as much significance as those that are intact and maintain kind of that integrity of what makes them special and significant. John's probably right. It's about 2 feet, and that's due to the roadways going in.
I'd like to just interrupt for a quick second. Is this the end of the presentation or are we going to hear more? I was thinking maybe it would be beneficial to hold our comments until the end of the presentation in case some of those questions will be addressed.
We're about 15% into the presentation.
Okay. Does that sound acceptable? If you have any burning issues, of course, feel free, but otherwise I think
Write
we
it
might
down.
want to hear the rest of the presentation. Thanks.
Yeah, there could be a lot of questions. So thank you, Emily. Next slide. So Caltrans's role in the project. So this is a city initiated project at this point, but Caltrans, it is an improvement to the state route 41 and 1. So Caltrans will be providing oversight. You need their approval on the environmental document and the design drawings. They're the lead, the city is the responsible party, but Caltrans is the lead agency. So they're represented here and we're talking to them about all the project alternatives and our path forward. They've been very cooperative. Caltrans is not a funding source or partner, but has oversight because it's a state road system. SLOCOG is also represented here tonight, and they are the funding partner for the project, along with any future grants that might be obtained from the state. And they've advised us already and will continue to advise us on funding opportunities for the project. Next slide. So this is a summary of the public outreach that we've completed and a few items that we still have on the horizon. We've met with the high school multiple times. We've met with PWAB multiple times. We've had SLOCOG hearings and briefings to City Council multiple times. At this point, we're looking for direction on alternatives. So that's what we're teeing up as part of this presentation. Next slide, please. This is the schedule looking backwards, and also what's on the horizon. We've completed a lot of the environmental document. We know what's out there. There's a very sensitive resource, and like Emily said, we're kind of over the hump on that one. So we're ready to move forward. The next step would be to complete the environmental document, release it for public review, and start the design process, which includes whatever alternative we pick would potentially have some right-of-way impacts to private properties, and utilities would potentially be impacted depending on which alternative we pick. And ultimately, the design drawings would need to be completed. Next slide, please. So this is the beginning of a lot of the alternatives that we're looking at right now. And the project is that kind of tees it up. You see the overview from the sky and the ground. Next slide, please. We wanted to revisit why improvements are needed to start the discussion. And right now, the State Route 41 and 1, the intersections of the ramp and the stop sign are only 75 feet apart, which leads to cars blocking the northbound off-ramp for moving through, primarily for the high school drop-off in the morning. Seems to be the peak travel times through this intersection. The close intersection spacing and stop control essentially operate as one intersection with 5 approaches and exits. And this intersection currently has the most number of collisions within the city. So we're looking at safety and congestion, amongst other things. Also, this is the gateway from the east for many of the travelers that are coming to the coast. Take the 41, and this is the first thing they see as they enter the city of Morro Bay and the Central Coast in general. So it is a pretty important point for traffic flow. Next slide. So one way to measure the congestion or the traffic flow through the intersection is something called a level of service. And in our traffic studies, we run numbers and modeling based on existing traffic flows and growth factors for future population growth. And we're able to determine if the intersection is going to function today and in the future acceptably, and to move cars through it and pedestrians as well. And we assign grades to them similar to the high school. A through C tend to be acceptable level of services. And the next slide, level of service D through F tend to back up. Sometimes they block other intersections, driveways. People are sitting at the light or the stop sign or wherever they're at, and they start to get frustrated and taking risks. You have to, at a stop sign, you have to make judgments, or at the off-ramp, you have to look for a gap in the traffic. And when the level of service starts to degrade, you start to take higher risks. There's more cars moving around, there's more pedestrians, and sometimes that leads to higher levels of collisions. Next slide, please. So this is the existing conditions of the intersection right now. We looked at them separately because technically they're 2 separate points with the existing stop signs. And the Main Street and SR 41 stop sign operates at level of service D currently, and the off-ramp is already at level of service F. We've actually already inputted the amount of traffic we expect from the Hampton Inn and the affordable housing into that existing condition. But that is a reminder that there's planned development in the area that would lead to more cars going through this intersection. So our growth factor considers that for the second table below. For the 20-year horizon, it does get to a level of service E at the stop control, at the stop sign. And you reach, at least in the morning, you reach a level of service F at the off-ramp. And what I'm seeing when I go out there today is that many of the high school students choose to get off at the off-ramp prior to SR 41, and they drive through by Taco Bell and they go through the stop sign because you can see the delays on there. It's actually a little faster to go through the stop sign. The more direct path would be the off-ramp, but it backs up, so they choose the stop sign.
So one quick point of clarification is the delay numbers there, those are delays in seconds. Is that correct?
Yeah. And just as a side note, the delay is the average delay for all people entering the intersection. The worst leg is in the morning going north, and the delay would be larger than the numbers represented. It's an average for all four corners of the stop sign. Next slide, please. This one's not as visible on these small screens, but basically we compared the collision data of this area to the Morro Bay Boulevard roundabout. They have similar traffic volumes, probably even more on Morro Bay Boulevard. But there's 23 accidents in the last 5 years at this current intersection that we're looking at, and there's 9 at the Morro Bay Boulevard roundabout. So it's more than double the issues that you have at the Morro Bay Boulevard roundabout. And that's a heat map of the collisions around the county that if you were to zoom in, you would see a hot spot of collisions at this intersection, but in comparison to other regional issues, this one isn't necessarily as high as other areas in the county, but it is a hot spot for Morro Bay. Next slide, please. So we are viewing the current intersection as an alternative. The pro would be there's no expense to leave it as is. There'd be no construction disruptions to businesses or high school students or any of the residents that are using this intersection. There'd be no impacts to the environment, like the cultural resource or businesses fronting the intersection. The cons are this congestion and collision rates will be increasing over time. And pedestrians don't seem to be well accommodated in the current intersection. And we've heard that from the students. And I think there's improvements that would be welcome there. Next slide. Could you get one more forward? All right, so the point here is we've heard a lot from the community about pedestrian safety. And so the existing intersection, what we're trying to demonstrate is once you enter the crosswalk, you're at risk of having a collision with a vehicle. And it's a wider street crossing than you would have in either of our alternatives. And next, if you can push one more. These are the different movements that cars might interact with the crosswalk. So if you just count them, there's 5 opportunities for a car to interact with a pedestrian once they enter the crosswalk. So this, for pedestrian safety, would probably be the worst alternative. Next slide. The double signal alternative, the pros would be that it, relatively speaking, compared to the roundabout, has a lower construction cost. It's $4 to $6 million for this improvement right now. There's less right-of-way impacts, so private properties would not be impacted as much as the roundabout, and there's less improvements. There's also more of a predictable traffic signal that people are used to using, driving and walking. So we do think that is a pro for this. The con would be that, we'll show the numbers, but it actually has longer delays than the roundabout. So the level of service is lower. in some areas, the level of service is actually lower than the existing stop sign. There's lower pedestrian safety in this alternative than the roundabout, and I'll show you that later. The life cycle costs, so the construction, maintenance, we also count for community costs. So collisions are part of that life cycle cost. There's a dollar amount assigned to different severities of collisions. So when you count all of those things and delays, if people are sitting there, there's a dollar amount assigned to that. So this is a higher life cycle cost for the double signal, and there's longer traffic delays. Next slide. So to envision what the signal would operate like, or the double signal, we've shown two examples from around the county that people may be familiar with. Arroyo Grande has a similar situation where you have a frontage road, Branch Street, that intersects Briscoe Road, and it also has off-ramps and on-ramps in a very close spacing arrangement. Paso Robles has one at Highway 101 and 46 and Ramada Drive. So in an aerial view, this is what those areas look like. And if we go one more forward and one more, they're currently planning a roundabout here to help with congestion and help with the intersection spacing issues that we have also. So the point that I'm making here is, that's what it would look like if we go with the double signal. And in this area, Arroyo Grande is looking at having to improve it because of the congestion. Next slide. So Paso Robles, again, this is the plan view. They're also looking at roundabouts to improve this intersection spacing issue, congestion, and the flow of traffic. Next slide, please. So for the double signal alternative, I wanted to show the pedestrian safety element. So again, we have if we go one more forward, we have a slightly wider street crossing than you would have in the roundabout. If we go one more. And those are the potential conflicts. Once you signalize it, you have less traffic moving through that crosswalk while there's a green light for the pedestrians to cross. But you still do have 3 turning movements that would interact with pedestrians in the crosswalk. And finally, the roundabout alternative has the highest level of service for traffic delays. There's less traffic conflicts than a signal, which we'll show later. The total cost for the community is actually lower. There's a life cycle cost analysis that we're required to do. And if you count the collisions and delays to the community and maintenance, for that matter, it's technically lower for the life cycle costs. And as I mentioned, traffic delays are improved and pedestrian safety is improved. It is a larger construction cost, which is a con, and there would be right-of-way impacts. So we would be dealing with the corners of this intersection and having to acquire some property to build this. Also, it's fairly innovative, even though we have one in Morro Bay. People may not be as used to driving through a roundabout as they are through a signal. So there's no predictable signal cycles for pedestrians or vehicles. Next slide. I brought this example up because it is in the city and people are getting used to using it. And we've heard concerns from the community that the pedestrian doesn't feel comfortable walking through here. And so what I'd like to talk about is this roundabout does actually function from a traffic flow perspective quite well. And as you can see, the collisions that we showed you are much lower here. But there could be some modifications for pedestrians that would improve that experience. And modern roundabouts typically include that. One thing is the it's hard without a laser pointer, but the top left corner is the busiest part of this roundabout. It's also the narrowest sidewalk that's pushed right up against the pavement. So you're not going to feel comfortable walking on a narrow sidewalk right next to 2 lanes of cars in the busiest corner of that roundabout. Also, the ped crossings, the crosswalks are quite close to the roundabout and where you'd be driving. Normally, those would be set back a little further to leave room for cars to leave the roundabout, but stop in case there's a pedestrian in the crosswalk. So I think on that corner, it's likely that the driveway for the gas station was a limiting factor. But you would work towards adding landscape buffers to the sidewalks to push the sidewalks a little further away from the traffic. And you'd also lean towards pushing those crosswalks a little further away from the traffic circle part. Next slide, please. This is, if you press play, this is a video of how one would function with cars and people walking and people riding bikes. It's about 2 minutes. So there the bike is able to exit onto the sidewalk if they choose to. It's set back from the roundabout for the crosswalks. There's also sometimes flashing beacons to help the pedestrian safety. Bikes are allowed to drive through the roundabout, and speeds in a roundabout are actually 15 to 20 miles an hour. So it's a little more conducive to riding a bike than an intersection. All right, next slide, please. And for the pedestrian safety element that we've heard about, we have other statistics that we'll show, but just from a project-specific example, the crosswalk itself that you'd be crossing is much shorter. So you have less time out in live traffic. So if you go to the next movement, there you go. So it's a short crosswalk before you enter a pedestrian refuge. And it's only one-way traffic. So if you go to the next slide, you only have to look left when you're crossing. You're not looking over your shoulder behind you. You're not looking left, forward, and right at the same time. If we're concerned about high school students having focus and being safe, there's less to look for in this particular condition. Next slide. So you get to the center of the roundabout, you can stop or you can proceed. Again, you have a shorter crosswalk distance and you have one direction of traffic. Side note for the driver, there's also less to deal with on this because the driver sees the pedestrian crosswalk first, then they enter the roundabout. So they don't have to be looking for cars at a stop sign at the same time they're looking for people in a crosswalk. So the driver has less to process as far as a decision goes. Next slide. So if you want to press one more forward, this is an animation of a pedestrian crossing. That's the triangle of where they're looking. Then they enter the middle, then they look the other direction, then they cross. So ideally, that's how it works. You're only looking at one direction of traffic. You have less time in the crosswalk, so it's inherently safer. The refuge islands are proven to actually work. We've heard concerns that the refuge islands aren't safe enough because you're in the middle of traffic, but there is statistics from the Federal Highways Administration that it's reduces pedestrian crashes by 32% to have refuge islands. Next slide, please. This is a comparison of roundabouts versus signals. And the overall collisions are almost 40% lower, 75% reduction in injuries, 90% reduction in fatalities, and 40% reduction in pedestrian collisions. So, this isn't specific to the project, but we tried to show how the pedestrian safety is specific to the project. But globally, nationally, these are just safer for people. Next slide. A little more serious topic is actually fatalities. And if you go one more slide, the typical intersection speeds are between 30 and 40 miles an hour when you have a green light. And the chances for fatalities is between 40% and 80% at that speed if you were to hit a pedestrian. And if you go one more further, the roundabout speeds are typically between 15 and 20 miles an hour. So if there were a pedestrian collision, it's about 20% chance of fatality. So it's just lower chances for fatalities. Next slide, please. These are the life cycle costs that we modeled for the project. As I mentioned, the collision costs do weigh into this quite a bit, and so do the delay costs. The project costs itself are there to the right, and then if you add them all up, there's other smaller costs like environmental for idling traffic, there's maintenance, and there's fuel. And if you add them all up, the actually existing, the no build alternative is ranking higher than both of these. And the roundabout and signal are fairly close together, even though there's more initial cost with the roundabout. Next slide. These are the specific numbers for each, but you're close to 6 million for life cycle costs if you leave the stop sign as is and accept the congestion and safety. And the roundabout and signal, double signal, are similar, with the roundabout slightly better for an investment in the community. Next slide. And to kind of summarize the presentation, this was our table for all the alternatives and the congestion that you might experience in the opening year, which would be a couple years from now, and in 20 years from now. And the no build would have the off-ramp experiences the worst delay of all of these if nothing's done. The stop sign starts to degrade from D to E. The double signal alternative actually doesn't improve all of the traffic delays. It's fairly similar to the stop sign, and the roundabout would last more than 20 years without having any improvements required. And I think that's it.
Thank you, John. At this point, we'll take questions from the PWAB again. I'm here to answer questions and moderate. We have John next to me. We have Eric Ridio, our city engineer, in the house, available for questions. John D'Annunzio from SLOCOG, or Mr. Irwin from Caltrans, as well as Emily Creel from SWCA. I incorrectly said she was from GHD earlier. I apologize for that. We are ready for questions.
Great.
And I'll let the questions go through the chair.
Oh, okay.
Go ahead with your question.
Ah, great. I live in the Heights, and over the last 10 years, I've used this intersection a bunch, taking my kids to the high school, and now on trips to minors. So I'm very familiar with how it works, and tonight I walked here from my house. So I walked through the Quintana Main Street roundabout, and I've spent a lot of years around heavy equipment, and I am in the habit of making eye contact with equipment operators. Cars are the same way. So much easier to make eye contact with drivers when I'm walking across the roundabout because they're only coming from one direction. They see me, I see them, and then we interact accordingly. On the walk here, I went through three intersections, and one was a roundabout, one was a light, and one was a stop sign. And I think the stop sign was the one that I felt the least comfortable in, and it was the closest one to here because I had to look in so many directions and make eye contact with a lot of cars. So with that said, I felt the most comfortable crossing the roundabout. The short distance, and this was actually one of my questions, what makes it safer? And you did a great job of answering that before I got to ask it. So thanks for explaining what makes it safer. The question that I have about the roundabout is when there's a peak flow towards the high school, that could create an exit of the roundabout in a platoon of cars, like a train of cars. What's the impact to all the other legs of the roundabout? Or when you get to the other side of the bridge, do you have an idea of what the impact will be to that ramp when there's a train of cars that have come out of the roundabout so efficiently?
Well, the signal, if you were to compare it to a stop sign signal and roundabout, the stop sign would actually meter flow a little bit better because you'd have one car at a time going through there. The signal, you'll actually have a larger platoon going at higher speeds, because once it turns green, you'll have maybe 10 cars move through all at once, with not much space between them. The roundabout typically operates at a slower speed, so you would have cars moving a little slower. The gaps would potentially be a little better than in a signal situation. And there's space for cars to stop if there is someone in the crosswalk. So we do anticipate flashing beacons in this location that would indicate to the cars that they need to stop for a pedestrian, or look out for them. So there's room to stop in a roundabout. In a signal, you're going to be moving actually in a bigger platoon at a faster speed.
And I had just one more question for you. I was looking closely at the signalized intersection proposal, and I noticed that the sidewalks are butted right up against the edge of the road, versus in the roundabout scenario where you have a landscaped area between the pedestrians and the cars. Is that by design, or can there also be a landscaped area between the pedestrians and the cars in the signalized plan?
You could definitely do that if you create the space for it. At a signal, typically the roadway is a little wider, because you have to put people into a left turn lane, a through lane, and a right lane. In a roundabout, you're just in a single lane. So there's more room for landscaping. But if we thought that was important, you could certainly add that. That's not uncommon in roadway improvements.
Other questions? Ian?
Yeah, I have a few questions. I own a property on 41, so I frequently use this area, 4 or 5 times a day. I'm wondering, as far as the design, you mentioned about the 2-foot depth of, digging for archaeological purposes. Have we thought about bringing the grade up, to seeing how it's in a flood zone for any of the designs? Also, I'm curious if any of the Morrow Road Bridge is included in any of this, like to try to maybe fix some of the failed infrastructure there. Also, I did go to Morro High School, and they used to have a U-turn in between the ramp and San Jacinto that you could take and then kind of go that way to the high school and U-turn off the freeway. Maybe something like that could be, implemented or put back in place. Those are just kind of my, questions.
Yeah, thank you for your question, Board Member Gaffney. Just broadly speaking, and I'll let John jump on those questions, but broadly speaking, the city has a lot of design elements at its disposal to implement with any of these alternatives. And so it's certainly useful feedback for us to hear what some of the ideas are with a given alternative, what kinds of design elements we can implement. However, I do want to just acknowledge that we haven't presented all possible design or design elements for each alternative. I know there's a lot of interest, for example, in either tunnels or sky bridges, pedestrian bridges, that kind of thing, raising it. So those are all good ideas, but we wouldn't want to put too much effort into that if we don't know what the design alternative that we're even going with is. So once we do get direction from City Council, we're hoping in June to move forward with one of the alternatives. We certainly will be discussing, okay, well, how do we make that alternative the best it can be for congestion, for cost, and of course for pedestrian safety. But I'll let Mr. Rogers answer the question.
Thanks. Raising the grade would be something we could look at. Sometimes when you change the elevation of roads, you overthink it and there's drainage issues. So we'd want to look at the drainage situation out there and make sure we're not causing a bigger problem by doing that. The Morrow Road improvements, I think our project is limited based on the Caltrans scope to be an operational improvement project. That's the purpose and need of it. So we could look at adding on pavement or other improvements with the focus still being on improving the operation. So the traffic flow, pedestrian flow through the intersection. And I remember that U-turn also. I'm not sure if Caltrans would be amenable to adding a U-turn on the highway. I'm guessing they removed it for safety reasons, but they could speak to that if we want to explore that more. I will say though that watching the intersection in the morning, parents and kids do get creative on getting through there. Some of them, and we talked to the students, some of them do actually skip the off-ramp and the stop sign. They go down to San Jacinto and do a U-turn, and it's faster for them. I've also noticed that some people turn right at the off-ramp and go through the stop sign and do a U-turn in the gas station, which also is faster. Dropping people off at the bike path, which is great. So they don't have to enter or exit the high school. So there's lots of different ways people are getting creative. And I guess the one thing I would say is if nothing's done and the congestion does get worse, then people are going to get more creative and could lead to some unsafe conditions. So.
Other comments or questions rather? Yes, go ahead.
I speculate that there are other urban areas around the world that have similar conditions in terms of lots of traffic and large numbers of pedestrians. I can recall experience in the center of London. It's very similar. So is it possible to draw from those best practices specifics as how many pedestrians a similarly situated roundabout in one of these urban areas has been able to handle, or how far the pedestrian walkways should be set back from the center of the roundabout, so that we can kind of learn from what we regard as best practices rather than sort of kind of hoping we've got the right idea. And I have a second question, but maybe if you want to address that one first.
Sure, I'd say that the current design does reflect some lessons learned over time from roundabouts being designed in America, and also a lot of FHWA's references do learn from the international community that seems to utilize roundabouts more than America. People are more used to them over there. So I would say that we've learned some over time with the modern roundabout design guidance that we have already. And I expect it to function a lot better than the current roundabout and fit the needs for the community. A big urban area like London has a definitely different level of volume of pedestrians and traffic, or even New York or some of the bigger cities. even in our county, this intersection really doesn't, it doesn't make it to the top of the list as far as volumes go. So we can learn from experience in, abroad and in America with our current guidance is what I'm expecting.
I would add, Advisory Board Member Ingraffia, that the data that we presented about collisions and safety and the data that gets plugged into the formulas that look at level of service is all based on data from the real world, from similar situation, not necessarily a similar format as what we have here in our intersection, but that data is pulled from other roundabouts, from other traffic signals. So in a way, maybe not in a qualitative sense, but in a quantitative sense, we are learning from other examples around the country.
All right, thank you for that, because I'd conclude that the structures do work in London, as I mentioned, there's a high pedestrian traffic. The second question, again, it's just a question of mine, and I think I probably know the answer, but I count 6 pedestrian walkways in this roundabout, and I could in my head think about eliminating 2, which reduces the opportunities for collisions with the pedestrian, but then again, it also increases the density of the pedestrian traffic in the other walkways. So my question is there any utility in reducing the number of walkways? And admittedly, you'll be restricting the path that pedestrians can go, but that might be a very, very small sacrifice.
I actually really like that idea, and it goes to your point as far as platooning cars. It seems like most of the cars are moving towards the high school. And if you could keep the peds off of that crosswalk, there'd be a lot less opportunities for incidents. So I'm not sure what Caltrans and the ADA community would say to that, because you might actually be adding distance to their walk to the gas station. But I think there's a really good argument to eliminate the crosswalk on the side that would be closest to the highway. I think it's a really good suggestion.
I again, it was just an idea of mine, but I was thinking you would the crosswalk in front of the northbound ramp and the crosswalk to the north of the roundabout on Main Street, and then if you placed a crosswalk much further on Highway 41 near the high school, so they could get to that side. So you would be routing students in a kind of a southerly direction, and the north would be relatively free of pedestrian traffic, and that might reduce, the possibilities.
I think it'd be a good wrinkle to look into if we end up going that route. I have noticed that the hotel constructed a crosswalk that's out there today that I don't recall seeing before. So kids can actually cross 41 in a crosswalk right now. Not sure if we would want that to be their main way to cross the 41, or if we trust the roundabout, the shorter crosswalk distances, but it's worth a debate and looking into. I think it could benefit the project.
And one more question. I was glad to hear that you talking about moving the crosswalks further away from the core of the roundabout. What about interposing some of those bumps in between the roundabout and the intersection, like they have in Atascadero on some of those main roads? Is that a?
I think we call those countermeasures and traffic calming, and whatever we think is going to make this the best use for the community is worth looking into. So I'm going to write that down, and eliminating a crosswalk, I think, is 2 really good wrinkles to the design once we go down an alternative.
Other questions? Go ahead, Jen.
This is just a curiosity. When you were talking about putting in the roundabout, you keep talking about having to access other property and buy other property. But then you've said that if you put in the signals, the street will be wider because you have to have the left turn, the right turn lane. So wouldn't you have to be obtaining property for those too? So that would make that price go up too, wouldn't it? Or is that in this price?
I think if you look at the design concepts, again, we haven't really picked one yet, so we didn't really dove in too deep. But yeah, there's probably some right-of-way impacts to the signal. There is. We know that for sure, especially for the sidewalks, because there's not a lot of sidewalk access right now and ped ramps. But just in general, the roundabout does clip the corners more significantly than the signal would.
Okay.
So I see that as a larger expense for that alternative.
John, you have some questions? Go ahead.
Okay. Let's start off, southbound intersection. Has there been any modeling of the impact of this on the southbound on and off ramps?
Kind of a line in the sand drawn on this project, and it seems to be the northbound off ramps and the stop sign. That's the area that was scoped as far as the project goes and the purpose and need. When Caltrans initiated the project and as it currently stands. So it's not part of the current project.
But there will be some definite impacts on the traffic flow at that intersection, isn't that right?
There definitely will be some impacts to that side of the intersection. Yeah.
Do we have any idea what they might be?
We haven't studied that in the traffic study.
Okay.
So you could logic through what the impacts would be, but a signal will, like you said, have larger platoons. The roundabout will have slower exit speeds. So there'll be larger gaps for people because on that side, there's no control. So you have to find a gap to try to safely move through the intersection. So we would expect larger gaps with a roundabout than a signal.
Okay. Yeah, I've noticed that when I'm trying to go on the southbound ramp, sometimes you do have to have your eyes or head on a swivel when you do that one too.
Turning left off the southbound off ramp in the morning would be difficult with all the morning traffic.
Okay. What is a typical, or what do you use to evaluate what the proper setback from entering a roundabout off ramp or whatever you call those things, to allow proper or usable time for a driver to stop if he sees somebody in the.
Based on the design speed, they're going 15 to 20 miles an hour, and you want at least one car to be able to queue there.
Mm-hmm.
So
I would think 2 would probably be more likely if at certain times of the day.
we could look into that. But yeah, I think right now it's one car stopping from 15 to 20 miles an hour and waiting for a pedestrian.
So,
I'm not sure pushing it back too far becomes a mid-block crosswalk, which has an unexpected crosswalk for a driver sometimes. So having it near the roundabout is preferred, and having at least one car to stop. It's kind of the rule of thumb right now.
Storm drain, has a preliminary hydraulic evaluation been done for any of the designs?
We don't see much increase in drainage. So because basically we're not planning to change the road grade, and it's a function of how much pavement you put in would increase the water. So it's a minimal impact. Plus some pavement would be removed and landscaping would improve. But again, we'd have to pick an alternative to do a full drainage analysis. We did look at the floodplain analysis or the FEMA floodplains, and the intersection does not land in the floodplain as it stands now. And it sounds like it actually didn't get completely flooded during the storms, but very close nearby, it was feet deep. So it's definitely a concern for the project.
Where does the storm drain at that intersection go anyway?
I don't think we've pulled the as-built. I have to look into that.
Okay.
There you go.
It drains into Morrow Creek.
Okay, cool. So it goes back up
Morrow Creek.
41 towards the creek then?
So storm drain's great if it's empty, but in a flood like we just had, it goes to Morrow Creek, which was flooded. So it tends to not actually drain anything.
Okay. So have you done any modeling of the pedestrians during the lunch hour? Because that is when the maximum number of pedestrians are wandering through that intersection.
I don't think that's in our traffic study, and we could add a lunch hour analysis, but we have an AM and a PM peak. I've observed the traffic at lunchtime and I've seen more pedestrians and a lot less cars. So I'm not sure what that would conclude in the traffic study, but we could add that.
Thank you. So roughly is what's the design contract cost for what we're dealing with right now?
You want to answer this, Greg?
Yeah, so
I'll answer.
as we met, the design contract,
Yeah,
I'm happy to weigh in.
if
Typically,
you have those numbers, yeah.
design costs for something that would go out to bid would be 10% of the construction cost. So for a Caltrans project, there's a lot of process to go through. So it would be about 10%. So depending on the alternative, it would be different.
okay. Just for my own curiosity, how tight can you get a car to turn on these, the on and off ramp things for the roundabouts? What do you use?
Well, it's a balance because you want to slow a car down, but you don't want to get a truck stopped, a big equipment truck. So sometimes we'll put curbs in where a truck can handle it, but we'll put striping in where a car is channelized to a smaller window. And you typically go with 10 to 12 feet for the striping. And the hard curb, including the median, would be larger in case you have fire trucks or semi trucks coming through here that would drag their wheels over the stripes.
And I noticed that are there any completed roundabout projects which are similar? I know that AG's got something which looks a lot like it, and I'm sure that there's other ones, but have you looked for any examples of roundabouts near schools with high volumes?
Yeah, I think we have a collage of roundabouts that our project, if we can pull the presentation back up. I'm not sure how easy that is, but I can speak to it a little bit. We do roundabouts throughout the state, so we've pulled what we think are similar to this particular condition. And we're also working on the Arroyo Grande one that I presented and the Paso Robles one that are planned. So we know what they're planning to do in those areas.
Do you have any
that are actually built?
Yeah, in
Yeah.
operation?
It's after the questions. We have some reference slides lower in the PowerPoint. In case questions came up, I loaded some reference slides. So we do have some pictures of roundabouts that have been built that we designed to modern roundabout requirements. And we have done one recently that was in front of a school. And there was a second one where there was a school nearby. So we met with their high school beforehand, and designed it to be safe for pedestrians. And in one case, we actually created a video for the school to play to try to educate the children on how to move through a roundabout safely. This one was mentioned to us from a community member. It's in Santa Barbara. It's not in front of a school, but it is an off-ramp. And you can see a roundabout sometimes takes the shape of the streets around it. So this one is a pretty unusual layout. And we've heard the city of Santa Barbara told us the pedestrian safety has been working out really well. Bicyclists use this, and the traffic flow has been great. This is one of the first ones Caltrans approved. So if you go down to Santa Barbara, you'll see it. Just coincidence, it was my senior project in college. I was working for the engineer that got hired to do the traffic study, and I sat on the corner and counted pedestrians when I was in college for this one. So it's exciting to see that someone brought it up recently. And I think there's a couple more. This is a collage of some roundabouts we've designed and overseen the construction, where the goal is to serve all the users, not just the drivers. So a lot of these have heavy bicycle usage or schools nearby. You see one has a pedestrian plaza right next to it. And part of it is setting back the sidewalks, with landscaping to help people feel safe. There's measures that can be added to cater to bicyclists that either want to ride on the road or ride on a wider sidewalk. And in school areas, you tend to see the flashing beacons to signify when pedestrians are crossing. So those are 4 of them. We have some videos too, if you guys would like to see fly arounds of roundabouts. But yeah.
So what does installing a flashing beacon usually cost?
It's a good question. I worked at the county for a few years, and we did a couple of flashing beacons projects, and they're a little bit expensive, in my opinion, more than you'd think for a sign, because it's a manufacturer and the supply chain. But I thought it was around 50 grand per flashing beacon.
About the same as a traffic signal, or a small traffic signal?
I think the signal poles are getting up there even higher, 150 grand maybe, something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, thank you. I have a couple of very quick questions. One, I think, is just to clarify the process. Is the city council the final decision maker on the preferred alternative, and then they will take into account the board's recommendation as well as all the public comments and the surveys that you've mentioned and all the other information you've gathered through public outreach?
Great question, Chair Beal. Almost, that's all true, what you said, that the city is the final decision maker, but on the city side only. They will be taking into consideration this board's comments and this board's vote, comments made in the public survey and the stakeholder survey for the high school. All the city council members were at the community meeting. So all of those comments will work their way into their decision. However, ultimately, that then becomes its own recommendation to Caltrans, which does have the ability to approve or deny our proposed project.
Okay, thank you. And then one other just quick question. I think this might be for Emily. I didn't hear in the list of pros and cons a mention of aesthetic resources. And I would tend to think that might favor the roundabout, but I don't know. So if you have a comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Thanks.
We're not there yet. When we realized really the big environmental effort was cultural, we didn't spend the time and the money on getting very far in those other technical reports, but we do have a visual specialist scoped who's working currently on, starting that analysis. I think the difference on visual resources may come down to more of how it's maybe aesthetically designed as kind of a gateway to the city versus the alternative. But as you indicated, a signal with infrastructure going, vertically into the view shed. It definitely will play into the analysis. And I wanted to just clarify one thing too. I think with a board member's comment earlier, if I can, there was a question about depth of disturbance 2 feet and seeing if we could minimize that. The areas in the cultural report where we found to be most intact are kind of on the fringe of the limits of disturbance for the project for both alternatives. So the depth of disturbance there is likely very shallow. It's just in the most sensitive areas. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we should probably move on ahead to public comment. We appreciate everyone's patience, and I thank the presenters for all the information we've been provided. I'd like to start with people who are here present in the audience. If they have comments, you're welcome to come forward. And then if people are listening online and would like to make a comment, we will get to you after we've heard from anyone in the room. Thanks. Please go ahead.
First of all, I have to dispute your remarks that there's 3 different plans because there's actually 4. My option is the 4th one, and it's better than the other 3 because it's much safer for the pedestrians and it takes out about 80% of the congestion. So it works better than the other 3. And apparently it was brought up by Red Davis when he was still alive, or someone told me that, something similar. I always thought he was kind of a sleepy guy going through life, but maybe he was the brightest guy on the city council. So if that's the case, I'm sorry that he passed away. But the plan I have closes 3 of the ramps at the 41 intersection because you don't need them. It only leaves 1 open, and that's the one that comes from the north for people who are coming down from Highway 1, from Big Sur, coming to Morro Bay. They can get off at 41 and either turn left and go to the valley or turn right and go to one of the many new hotels. We got Hampton Inn, we got Motel 6. There's three motels and 2 campgrounds to the west of Highway 1. And so those people, and by the way, this is predicated on the fact that eventually they finish 41 as it wraps around by the old sewer plant and goes directly to the Embarcadero, which is where the money should be spent instead of this stupid roundabout. Roundabouts were created, if anybody knows the genesis of roundabouts, they were created because the thought was that people wouldn't have to stop at lights, so they'd burn less gas and create less pollution. That's the genesis of it. But now they've apparently discovered that cow farts create more pollution than cars, so they just want to kill all the cows, and then we won't have to worry about it. That'll piss off McDonald's and Burger King, but oh well. But that was the genesis of the roundabouts, but they're not particularly safe. And the one you're showing that could end up at 41 is 6 different roads. The one at Morro Bay Boulevard only has 3. And even at 3, I've gone into Sinclair before to get gas, and I can't get back out on Morro Bay Boulevard because the cars keep going by. I sit there for 10 minutes wasting gas and trying to get out of the Sinclair parking lot. So I think roundabouts are stupid. But this method that I came up with that apparently Red Davis came up, you don't need those 3 ramps, and the traffic moves people from the valley. If they're going to the 3 motels or the 2 campgrounds to the west of Highway 1, they go right under Highway 1 and they're there. And if they go to the #1 tourist destination, which is the Embarcadero, always has been, they should be able to wrap around to that and go directly to the Embarcadero. People from the Embarcadero can go the other direction if they're heading back to the valley where I used to live in Fresno. I used to come over here in the 1950s. And of course, traffic is a lot worse now and it'll continue to get worse. But the option I have takes 80% of the traffic out of the 41 intersection. So there's no congestion and it's safe for pedestrians because the kids from high school will only have to cross 1 street really if they're going to lunch, and that's Main Street, because 3 of the 4 ramps will be closed, dig them up, remove the asphalt, plant dirt and plants. And it's just, it's a better system. It's a safer system, and it removes most of the congestion. Just does. And you can study it if you want to. And if you have any questions, let me know.
Okay, thank you.
And Chair, I'll mention that Janine here will have a timer on her phone, and that alarm means that 3 minutes have gone by.
All right.
Good evening, Board.
Please go ahead.
Paul Donnelly, resident of Morro Bay.
and all due respect to John, the promoter of the roundabouts, he's not paying for it. So last Wednesday night, I asked how much is the city paying for this? No matter how much you get from Slow Cloud, the city is still gonna have to cop up millions of dollars, but it simply does not have. The other thing is, and I disagree with the fact that the roundabouts are not pedestrian friendly and they're not truck friendly either. Now, one thing about a signalized intersection is like they do in places like Waikiki and in Las Vegas, they have a phase dedicated pedestrians only, and then they let the traffic move through. They even have some where you can go diagonally across the intersections. That would be much safer for the kids to have a dedicated signal for them only and stop all traffic and then let the traffic move. I know there might still be congestion. That's not going to change. You're adding a lot more legs to it with the Hampton Inn and with the other facility. But the problem I see is the cost. You're asking for a very, very expensive project. Then what are you going to do with the traffic during construction? Because there's no way around this intersection. There really isn't. You'll tear up the entire roadway, and the traffic has to be able to move through there somehow. The other thing is there's an impact, as you mentioned on the, I think it was on the Chevron property. They said the other night that they'd have to close one of the entrances or driveways. That would be a severance or an impact cost, a loss of revenue to the Chevron gas station. So that may be an additional cost you may have to consider. We may have to compensate them for their loss of business because of that. Thank you.
Thank you. And yes, please go ahead.
Oh, thank you for being here. My name is Nancy Bast. I've lived in Morro Bay a long time. I know with the roundabout at the front of the city, the one we have, we had to buy a lot of property in order to make that roundabout. How big is the area where you want to put this roundabout, and will you have to buy private property to do that? That was one question. I personally prefer the idea of a signal because you can program signals so there isn't such a lot of congestion. The signal on Main Street in Quintana is a really fine programmed signal. It lets you go through. If nobody's coming the other way, it changes. And so I think maybe somebody was quite brilliant when they did that. And I think the signalization on instead of the roundabout could serve very nicely because the signal keeps the kids organized. I've noticed that right now they dribble through the intersection when they get there for lunch. They don't stop and go through all at once. So it's very confusing for pedestrians and the traffic people. The inability to move cultural remains, if there's more than one, seems to me that it would preclude the RAB, the roundabout. I'd like to know what the legal issue is in moving cultural remains, if there's a limit. And we're going to spend $12 million on this thing. What if it doesn't work? I mean, we're going to be in a heck of a mess if it doesn't work. And I'm pretty sure it's not going to work because there's just too many things wrong. Semis come from 41 into this town all the time. I mean, all the time. And that roundabout, I've seen some pretty strange semi movements around the roundabout we do have. Please consider that.
Thank you. Go ahead.
All right. Hello, members of the council and locals of Morro Bay, Los Osos, and Cayucos in the audience. My name is Clarissa Olmos, and I'm a senior here at Morro Bay High School. It's no surprise and nothing new that the main intersection next to the gas station has always been an issue and a hazard to the area surrounding it, and especially to the people commuting it. Loads of cars coming from every direction, trying to get from one side to the other in hopes that everyone knows how to properly utilize the intersection. Whether you are trying to cross over and get on the 41, trying to make a left turn onto school grounds, trying to get gas in the corner gas station, especially in the early hours of the day, and around 3:30 p.m. when all students are trying to get home. Everybody's in a rush. There is, in such a small compacted space, there is really not enough space for people to think that they can just rush through it. Everybody thinks that they have the right of way, or everyone is entitled to their turn, whatever the circumstance, in order to lessen the entitlement to rush and lessen the amount of near accidents and angry commuters, and especially for the safety of the pedestrians, mainly the students who commute to school on foot. It would be most intelligent to install stoplights in the intersection that nobody is entitled to nobody's entitled to rush. The light says green, you go. The light turns red, you stop. There is no one is angry over whose turn it was in close collisions that happen every single day. It would take significantly less time to install and cost significantly less amount of money, as well as being safer. There are a lot more cons to constructing a roundabout, especially since people already fail to properly utilize roundabouts, the already existing roundabouts, and a four-way without stop signs or signals. How would we utilize a roundabout more effectively than stop signals? Most people can argue that a roundabout is safer for pedestrians and relieves traffic congestion because it keeps the flow of traffic going, but the already installed roundabout in our city has never experienced dozens of loads of cars coming from the high school, coming in and out of high school at 8 a.m. and 3:30 p.m., mixed with the cars that are already coming from the merging off of the freeway, mixed with the cars coming from the 41. And the crosswalks in the already existing roundabout that are meant for people to cross are actually what cars utilize to yield. You can see how that issue speaks for itself. With stoplights and signals, it is a must that there are set specific crosswalks where pedestrians are given a clear, concise opportunity to safely cross over. Although this issue will not affect me anymore once I move away for college this fall, I think it is important to take into consideration the future safety of the younger grades below me who I've grown to know and love and care for. I hope that you evaluate all your data and weigh out the pros and cons and hopefully come to the clear conclusion that a stoplight would be more ethical, effective, and safer for our community.
Thank you. Next.
Good evening, Morro Bay Congress. My name is Ava Pepley, and I'm also a senior at Morro Bay High School. I stand before you today as a concerned member of this community to address an issue that affects the safety and well-being of our students and residents alike. The intersection near our schools became a matter of great concern. First and foremost, I would like to introduce my experience as a teenager who drives to school. I experienced firsthand effects of traffic in the morning, and it is more than frustrating. Much like you adults going to your jobs, I'm sure you understand having to leave early enough to get to work on time. Leaving 30 minutes early to get to school with an expected 10-minute commute and still being late because of the traffic from the off-ramp and surrounding areas is something that really frustrates our students. It's important for us to acknowledge that morning traffic congestion is a common issue that affects not only students, but also other commuters in our community. All of Morro Bay's students, Los Osos, Cayucas, Atascadero, are all meeting at this one spot to get to school. When there are 6 people all at once trying to turn separate ways, it becomes really tricky, especially when everyone drives differently. The matter of the fact is, as students, we are just trying to get to school, but it really does become hard traversing the most congested intersection in Morro Bay. There are roughly 800 students at Morro Bay. Roughly half of them drive. Like you said, a roundabout is superior for helping congestion and is safer for pedestrians. However, I'd like to respectfully disagree. I don't think that it's safer for pedestrians in this situation. You have to keep in mind that these are teenagers driving. These are not adults driving that have been driving for 40 years. And even then, adults aren't even like as good when it comes to yielding. It's not, they don't have to do it. It's an option. And I'm sure every adult in here can agree with me that like, you know, it's yielding. You don't have to, but obviously you still should. When 414 and 15-year-olds from our school are walking to Taco Bell at lunch, while the other 400 are roughly leaving in their car, removing these stop signs, forcing a stop rather than it being an option is not a great idea. I'd also like to mention you saying that removing crosswalks as well, and I don't think that this is a good idea. I can see your main point as to why you think this, but removing crosswalks isn't going to make students not walk there. They've done it for 1 to 2 and 3 years already. So why would they just stop? Because it's removed. It only removes the ability for them to do it safely. It doesn't remove the ability for them to cross. They will continue to do it no matter what. Like they've already been doing it. So for these reasons, I stand with the statement a roundabout is not the best option. To conclude, it is crucial for us to recognize the urgent need for installing stoplights or some alternative at the intersection near our school. The children's safety and well-being of our entire community is at stake. By taking action and investing in this infrastructure, we can create a safer, more efficient environment for all of our residents. Thank you.
Thank you.
A hard one to follow. Bill Martini, Morro Bay. I think signalization for 2 reasons is the best option. I've been through roundabouts. They're very user-friendly for cars, terrible for pedestrians. I can remember being in Rome, trying to get across. I had 2 nuns. I let them run interference, barely made it across. But I do know on the roundabout that we have now at Quintana that I've seen pedestrians and they're kind of really standoffish because the traffic is flowing so fast. It's very intimidating. Sticker shock. I don't know how signals, you can get up to 4 million or 12 million. You know, you're talking 150,000 just for a pole to hang a traffic signal on. I mean, this is insane. You know, telephone poles like $1,000. So sticker shock for 12 million is, to me, would be out of the question. Signalization, I can see it, but I can't see the price tag. I mean, it is much safer. I'll go back to pedestrian signalization because you know when to go, everything's stopped. And like you say, you can designate if it's just pedestrian only, you know, hit the light. With AI on the horizon, I mean, they can analyze traffic and adjust the lights to, you know, check the traffic and adjust times and that. So it should flow a lot better than they have in the past. But at this intersection, and I've seen intersections like this, Montecito has one coming into Montecito, and it works great for cars, but it's terrible for the high school. So I would recommend signalization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Linda Winters, and I live on 1680 Main Street. For those of you who don't know where that is, it's about a block down here and a block down there. And we face, my home is 30 feet from Main Street. It's 90 feet from the Highway 1 off ramp and 300 paces from the driveway to the intersection of where we live. So this intersection is very much of a concern for all of us that live in the mobile home park. And there's a couple people in here that live. Everyone that lives in our park are acutely aware of the intersection as we must deal with it and its possible dangers every single time we leave our homes, in our cars, as pedestrians, on bikes or scooters. There's no safe way to exit the park during school hours, when classes are starting, during the lunch hours, and as school ends, the school session ends. We also have heavy traffic times as the commuters are coming and going to work. And let's not forget about what happens on the weekends when everybody in the world wants to come to Morro Bay on Highway 41. That's just strictly speaking for folks from the south side of Maine and Highway 41. There's hundreds more that live on the northbound and east side of that intersection. And we are all concerned about the fact that this intersection needs attention. That's a given. As I've read through all of the traffic surveys and assessed the different options with all of the alternative plans that are presenting human interests in our environment, I saw a possible and immediate fix for the traffic flow. And I believe, John, you called it traffic calming. Immediately place traffic speed bumps or those little white bumps, which I don't know what they're called, but they slow traffic down to get the people used to slowing down before they get to the intersection. That's one of the biggest problems that we have. Those automatically slow drivers down. After those are applied, drivers can become accustomed to the conditions before they enter the intersection. We all know that just lowering the speed limit doesn't slow drivers down. Then the city and state can proceed to whichever option is decided upon. I have a personal preference, the roundabout, and I'll be happy to see something, nay, anything being done for this traffic nightmare. I will always be concerned about the students and the seniors using the crosswalk. They both have different motives, but they all would like to get to the other side of the road alive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, board. Thank you for your service. Staff, thank you. My name's Judy Setting. I graduated from this school. I'll tell you when. 1973. And oh my gosh, it was a wonderful place to be. And when I see the campus like this, I'm super jealous. It's fabulous. I'm so happy for our kids that they get this for their high school experience. So my husband and I live in the Cloisters and experience the high school pedestrian activity almost daily. This activity involves over 100 students accessing the crosswalks during the lunch hour between, I think the kids told me 12 and 1 or 12:47 and 1:30-ish. These awesome students are running against the clock with 3 things on their minds: food, socializing, and getting back to class on time. These kids take priority. Regarding a roundabout, having a safe tunnel or overhead for them is a must. There are way too many crosswalks to navigate, and they make the route longer. There goes getting back to class on time. Regarding signalizing, it appears 2, possibly 3 signals are needed. Signals will slow our awesome students down just a bit, but they will also provide much needed safety and traffic will run smoothly. It appears the safe tunnel or overpass have been tabled. I don't know if I'm right about that, but it was in correspondence. And I think that's too bad. I love roundabouts. I love our Quintana roundabout. I loved that my husband and I navigated the Arc de Triomphe at rush hour on a Friday night. If we had had to worry about crosswalks, I don't know what we would have done. That's my main concern with this one is the crosswalks. In an effort to keep our high school kids safe and save $8 million, Rocky and I petitioned for solving the 11 points of entry and exits pain in the street dilemma by installing 3 signals. I enjoyed the roundabout presentation. I think you did a wonderful job. I believe that you missed the mark by not offering a model that showed actual students, a roundabout near a high school with students, 100 students just rushing in a 45-minute period. And I hope that that's something you'll work on. And I did have a question about your other roundabout projects. Are you always under budget?
Thank you. We have additional comments? Yes, go ahead, please.
Good evening, Chair Beal and Commission. I'm John D'Annunzio. I'm a regional transportation planner with the San Luis Obispo Council of Government, SLOCOG. I wanted to share with you the concept of road to zero, or sometimes it's known as Vision Zero. So this is the concept that all roadway fatalities and serious injuries are unacceptable, and how we can work towards that goal. So the Road to Zero initiative at the state and federal level revolves around the safe systems approach. And to describe this, I'd like to ask you first to imagine a printing factory where large pieces of paper are put into a machine, and then a heavy guillotine comes down and cuts the paper into nice reams of letter-sized sheets. Now, before the safe system approach was introduced at the factory, the operators of the machines would occasionally suffer accidents as they were loading the sheets of paper. But with the safe systems approach, new technology was introduced where both hands that the operators used were on buttons safely away from the machine before it would operate. So by changing the design of the machine to account for user error, the system itself became safer. That's the safe systems approach. As community planners, we cannot control the error on the roads, whether a person decides to drink or drive or to send a text while operating a vehicle. And we can't design, unless we're the ones to design the cars, to build safer cars, nor are we necessarily the ones trained to respond to critical life-saving incidences of a tragic collision, such as our emergency and public safety professionals are. But as city planners, we can control safe speeds and safe roads by making evidence-based decisions, weighing the trade-offs, listening to our licensed engineering professionals who are accounting for kinetic energy from vehicles of all shapes, sizes, users, ages, and abilities. We can help to educate our young and aging population to be alert and conscientious drivers and to navigate new roadway configurations if a new roadway configuration is ultimately decided upon by decision makers and project sponsors. So beginning this fall at the regional level, SLOCOG is going to be working closely with the Board of Supervisors and leaders from the 7 cities, as well as public health, public works, to develop a road to zero safety policy. We understand the city of Morro Bay is working on a local road safety plan, which will help the city identify the priorities and make it eligible for future safety funding. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Peggy Mandeville, and I'm a resident of Morro Bay. Given the information presented tonight, I support moving forward with the roundabout option for safety and operational reasons. However, the southbound off-ramps should be evaluated as part of the roundabout design, and a traffic simulation created to show how the intersections will operate for vehicles and pedestrians in the morning, at noon time, and after school. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Board. My name is Doug Hill. I'm a resident of Morro Bay. I'd like to advocate that the Board recommend the roundabout option. I think in the long run, it's, it'll be cheaper in the long run. There's numerous studies that show how separating pedestrians from traffic is much safer. Both the Department of Transportation and the Insurance Institute has noted that roundabouts are much safer. And I think that's one of the major concerns. Obviously, the costs are the concerns, but in the charts that were shown, the long-term costs are smaller for the roundabout. So I think I would like to advocate that you recommend this to the City Council. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further public comment?
Hi, I'm Margaret Carmen, a resident of Morro Bay, and I've been driving for 50 years since Jimmy Carter signed my first driver's license in Georgia. And happily, I haven't had any major car accidents, but I got to tell you, I live really near the Morro Bay Boulevard roundabout, and every time I go through there, I have concern. I feel really unsure because they're just all, and when somebody walks, oh, God forbid when somebody tries to walk in that one, and that's only every once in a while, it's a person walking in that. So I want to say that, and I want to say I'm often in the 46 Vineyard Road roundabout, which is how much bigger is that than the one you're going to have near this high school? And there's still all these skid marks from big trucks. And, we don't have, I just feel like you don't really have enough room to put in an adequate sized roundabout. I know that it's the pet toy. It is like the Christmas toy that everybody wants is now a roundabout in the world of planning, but I'm for the traffic signal. And I really, really, really like the statistics, which somebody's already mentioned it, but I want to put it out in my public comment. What are the statistics on roundabouts near high schools where everybody's going one direction? It's not even like you're leaving Morro Bay High School and you're going toward the ocean to get food. No, everybody's going in one direction. So I feel like that's an issue. And I'd like to know, I didn't look it up ahead of time, when you take a driver's test now, do you have to go through a roundabout? Do you have to prove that you know how to drive in a roundabout? I'm not talking about just in the book, because I think that's a really huge consideration to know for these young people that are newly licensed. And we know how many of them are on their phones and they're got other people. And I just think the roundabout is not very safe in that respect. And I'd like to know the stats on cars being just rear-ended in a roundabout, because you can have a rear end accident, because I'm a chiropractor, and you might not even have damage to your bumper, but they've proven that you can have a major atlantoaxial subluxation, and that's without, it wouldn't even be on your statistics, I bet you, those kind of accidents. So I'd like to know something about that. And the other thing is, if God forbid you do a roundabout, I really hope that we can ask for better signage, because I feel like you get off Highway 1 at Morro Bay and Quintana, and it doesn't tell you what kind of roundabout you're going to go into. So you as a driver have no ahead of time knowing how you're going to maneuver. So that's another reason I just think they're very dangerous. And when we saw that nice video in La Quinta, there was a lot more room for that roundabout. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'll make this brief. I'm the parent of 2 high school students here at Morro Bay High School. And I would like to go with the recommendations of the roundabout because I want them to be as safe as possible here. So thank you so much for considering.
Thank you. And are we finished with our live public comments? I think we are. Let's find out, is there anyone in our virtual audience that would like to comment? No? Okay, we are finished with public comments. So the next task for the board is to make a recommendation. If anyone would like to begin, feel free.
Okay. I've listened to all of this, just like everybody else, and I have to say, I'm thinking about the pros and cons of the traffic signal versus the roundabout. The thing that concerns me on a traffic signal is that I understand there are going to be like 5 lights. And so the wait is going to be, if you're the first one, if you get to your light and you're the first one there when it turns red, you have about 1.5 minutes to wait before you can go. And if there's a light in the morning, I'm hearing all this backup of traffic in the morning, you might not get through the light and you might have to wait for a second light. So you're going to be sitting at a light in the morning in the rush hour traffic for 3 or 4 minutes before you can get through. And then think of how then I think about how the traffic is going to be backed up on the freeway off ramp if they can't get through the stoplight. So that sort of concerns me about that. And it may be easier for the pedestrians to maneuver and everything, but basically then, and I know the roundabout costs more, but in the long run, you're saying it will be less. And it just seems to me that it's easier to move through, that the pedestrian crossings on these pictures seem like they are going to be well marked, and you're talking about the beacons. That sounds good. There might be buffers between the street and the sidewalk, and the traffic will be flowing through evenly. So, and I think people can learn to drive through roundabouts. I've gone through a lot of roundabouts. I'm lucky enough to be able to travel somewhere every year, nice. And everywhere I go, they're roundabouts. And in Europe and places, and I don't see them, they're beginning to be more in America. But you're talking about the young people not being able to, just being new drivers and not being able to use this. I think you'd be surprised they will catch on faster than the older drivers will. And so for all of this, I think we should all, I think the roundabout is just the better choice. I think that it would just keep traffic moving, and it will be safer, and we can learn to do new things. So I vote for the roundabout.
Well, before we vote, we will need a motion and know what we're voting for, if anyone would.
I have a question about what is the scope of the recommendation we can vote on? Is it anything we want, or do we have to keep it limited to northbound, northbound off and on ramps in the intersection of 41 and Main?
Thank you, advisory board member Irwin. I'll answer your question in a couple of ways. There are some rules here, and we don't want to deliberate on items that weren't agendized. And so the agendized item here is the intersection at 141 and Main Street. That said, if there's suggestions that are outside of the 3 alternatives that were presented to staff, certainly the PWAB is entitled to make suggestions. But I would caution, because I heard a lot of the comments from the PWAB earlier were, I would call them sub decisions. So, if we do X alternative, we'd also want to see this thing too. Again, those are good suggestions, but those sub decisions will be evaluated at a later time. So that's all by way of saying, yes, you can deliberate on other items, but we want to keep it to this intersection because that's what was agendized.
Okay. I'd like to make a motion whenever.
Well, we would normally take the motion when it's ready and then have discussion prior to voting.
Okay. So you will get your, well, the motion I would like to make is, of the choices offered, the roundabout makes the most sense engineering wise to me. My personal preference is the Red Davis plan, or even blocking off the northbound off ramp and directing it towards Errol Street rather than, but I understand that gets into some legal issues with Caltrans.
Advisory board member Irwin, if you could state the motion itself.
Okay, so the motion is subject to adding additional evaluations, that the preferred plan as presented is the roundabout, subject to evaluating the Red Davis plan or redirecting the northbound off-ramp towards Errol Street.
And that's your recommendation to the city council to
Yes.
pursue. Understood. And so it sounds like Chair Beal that there was some discussion.
So there's a motion to recommend the roundabout, but with the condition that, what was your condition? Could you please restate that?
Well, the plan presented is the Red Davis plan. It makes a lot of sense to me. Or redirecting the northbound off-ramp for Highway 1 towards Errol Street, rather than going all the way to 41.
Would anyone like to second that motion?
So it now could be a point of discussion before a second, and I believe there was an advisory board member that was interested in some deliberation with that.
Not yet.
Yes, actually, it should be seconded before we discuss it. Thank you. I'm not hearing a second, so I will make a motion to recommend the roundabout without the condition aforementioned.
And I second.
So speaking to my motion, I was persuaded by the scientific and technical information that was presented and the data that was presented regarding the long-term costs and benefits. And that is the basis for my motion. And I invite other board members to engage in further discussion.
May I? I find myself in a peculiar situation here, and I'm bear with me because I'm figuring it out myself. Certainly to do nothing is not a responsible alternative. And there are very distinct disadvantages to the signaling system, and the advantages to the roundabout are fairly indisputable when it comes to the traffic increase in the amount of traffic volume it can accommodate, and the lower maintenance, and the lower CO2 emissions, and the lower fuel consumption. And I'm encouraged by the ease with which the existing roundabout works, although I realize that there are considerable more complexities in this one. I think it's absolutely essential that we get some sort of simulation of how this roundabout will operate with large numbers of pedestrians, including high school students going through it. That's absolutely essential. And then, of course, what's paramount is that there be some real assurances that no unduly risk are presented to the high school students. You know, I'm reminded of the words of Mark Twain, and when he said what is addressing about what everybody knows to be true, but just ain't so. I am convinced that this kind of an infrastructure in the long run is safer. But that's a statistical conclusion. And I would like there to be some safeguards in this that I can find some confidence in. And I don't feel that I can recommend this to the city council without insisting that those additional assurances be included. But I'm not an expert. I'm not a traffic engineer. So I don't really know if my ideas are good. They seem commonsensical to me, but I'm not an expert. So what am I talking about? Well, as I mentioned, oh, and one other thing I'd like to add. At an earlier meeting, with respect to eliminating one or more of the highway on-ramps and off-ramps, I thought the response was persuasive that would overburden the other nearby on-ramps and off-ramps, and was simply not viable. Now, again, I'm relying on expert advice for that, but that's what I heard at the meeting, and I found it convincing then. So it seems to me, yes, we have the infrastructure. Yes, we have to have some convincing simulation. Yes, we have to have these light systems embedded in the road so that it will alert drivers, particularly those that are unfamiliar. Yes, we have to have some speed bumps to slow the travel even further. And again, I can't tell this audience or my colleagues here how much further the walkways should be removed from the center of the roundabout, but they have to be further, certainly, than the one that exists today and further than most of the examples that I've seen. And I was surprised and glad to hear that, my suggestion of perhaps eliminating at least 2 of the pedestrian walkways might make the intersection even safer. And it even occurs to me that perhaps in the initial learning period, it's not going to go over very well with the high school students, particularly the juniors and the seniors, but there might even be a crossing guard who is there to gather some of the students and assemble them into some kind of group so there can be a collective crossing rather than this constant flow. I don't know if that's a good idea or necessary, but it might help in the initial orientation for the whole community. But again, I'll repeat, I don't know how I can approve this to the city council without all those additional considerations being included, because I certainly don't want a sort of one size fit all. Yes, this board recommended that a roundabout be built at that location, but absent those important details.
Thank you. Any additional discussion?
I agree with Joe. I agree with Joe that we have been given very limited ability to evaluation. I understand the direction given to the consultant for what he was allowed to look at, but I think that direction was limiting and it would preclude possibly more efficient solutions to the problem than were presented.
If there's nothing further, I would suggest we go ahead and take a vote on the motion to recommend the roundabout alternative. And then we'll see where we are after that.
Thank you, Chair Beal. Advisory Board Member Ingraffia.
No.
Advisory Board Member Irwin.
No.
Advisory Board Member Goldman.
Yes.
Advisory Board Member Gaffney.
Yes.
Advisory Board Member Nava.
I'm sorry, the vote is for the furtherance of.
The roundabout without specific additional conditions.
Gotcha.
We
Yeah.
can still make additional recommendations, but it wouldn't be part of the vote.
I agree, yes. I vote yes.
Chair Beal.
Yes.
Okay, the motion passes, and may I suggest that the city staff, depending on what the alternative that's chosen, gets chosen, it's certainly safety considerations or any other consideration for the build out could be brought back to the PWAB.
Yes, thank you. And I know you've been making notes, and the additional recommendations that have been provided, while not part of our official vote, certainly bear the weight of those recommendations. Did you have something? Go ahead.
I have a question for Greg. I have a significant amount of training and experience with roundabouts. Am I okay to talk to other board members independently, one at a time, with the Brown Act to help answer questions?
I'd suggest you send me that question in an email, and I could adequately vet that. I would be very cautious about that because that could turn into a kind of a chain deliberation. And we'd want to avoid that. That said, if it's not something that would be under deliberation by the PWAB, I don't know that it matters. However, if a roundabout is chosen by the city council and given a green light from Caltrans, there may be more items coming back to the PWAB regarding that roundabout. And so, that could get you not in a good spot. So please send me that in an email and I can vet that question.
Yeah, and also please, if there's anything else you'd like to add in terms of the discussion, feel free to do that. We have a few extra minutes here.
There were comments about traffic passing through during construction, and plans typically come out with stages of construction, and that's vetted through the design process about how vehicles will get through the construction site. There was concern about cars entering a roundabout and at high speeds. Roundabouts are typically designed with a constricting lane. It gets smaller and there's usually turns. These design features are subconsciously slowing drivers down before they get into the roundabout. So there's no real need for a lot of signs or flashing beacons. The design of the roadway slows the cars down. Speeds in the roundabout are controlled by the outward pitch and the tightness of the radius. So you can't go faster than 15 miles an hour and keep traction. Your car will start to slide. There's just so many features about a roundabout that make it safer, that are well engineered, well thought out, have been in place for generations, and we are finally catching up here in California. 2 new roundabouts going in Montecito that we're building. There's more that have been talked about here. Very high volume areas, lots of pedestrians, lots of tourists. They operate when there's no power normally. I just can't stop talking about the praises of them, but yeah, they're a huge benefit. They would be a huge benefit to our city. I appreciate the effort going into this design. It looks like it's got a lot of the concepts in place already at this early stage of design. So thanks for all the effort.
All right, thank you. So does that complete item A2?
Yes.
All right. So we have one final item, A3. This is not going to require an official motion of the board, but we can provide recommendations on third quarter water reclamation facility. Presentation.
Thank you, Chair Beal. We just have some musical chairs happening here. Just give us a moment to catch up. Paul, do you want to come up? He has a thumb drive. Yeah. If the PWAB would like to take a bio break, I don't know if is that of interest to take a bio break?
Sure, we'll take a 5-minute break.
5-minute break.
We meet on, the PC meets on.
All right, I'm gonna recommend we get their other agenda item going here as soon as everyone's ready. All right, let's reconvene. We have one remaining agenda item. Do we have a presentation?
Yes, thank you, Chair Beal. I'll just briefly state that this is a recommendation to review the information being presented and provide input on that will be forwarded to the City Council, very likely at their next meeting, I believe on May 23rd, 4th, thank you. 3rd. 23rd. Thank you. So yes, we do have a presentation from our program manager, Paul Amico, who is with Carollo. And he will jump into it about, again, a couple of amendments and also review of the WARF quarterly report for Q3 of fiscal year 23.
Thank you, Director Qualick. Good evening, members of the advisory board and remaining citizens of Morro Bay. Again, my name is Paul Amico. I've been serving as the program manager for the Water Reclamation Facility Program. And this is, so if I could get the next slide, please. Tonight, we'll be talking about the WRF quarterly report, as we do every quarter. As I would say, it's kind of strange because it takes us about 6 weeks to compile the data for each quarter and then prepare the report and get to PWAB and then council for this. So our presentation generally covers what happened 6 weeks ago. And in this case, so tonight I'm going to have a construction update. And I'm glad to say with the construction update, this is going to be the last construction update that I will give for major construction of the Water Reclamation Facility Program. So if we could get the next slide, please. I'm glad to say that the conveyance facilities and the water reclamation facility, or the Water Resources Center, as we've come to call it, are both substantially complete. And so the pictures you see here, that is pump station, what we call pump station B. It's the one adjacent to Limo's. And then the picture on the right is one that I'm especially glad to see, which is the opening of the bike path. And I know that I am long and last in line on being glad to see that the bike path has been open. And so we've been fielding questions about the bike path ever since, I will admit, I was wildly optimistic about its opening date, and that was my fault. So I'll accept responsibility for that. Next slide, please. So substantial completion. I made mention that both the water reclamation facility and the conveyance facilities are substantially complete. Substantial completion is a contract milestone. It is a contract definition. It's issued when the facility is available for its intended use. That does not mean it's completely done. That does not mean it has reached final completion. What we generally do, or what we have to do at substantial completion, is we collaborate with the contractors on what we call the punch list. It's remaining work items. So think about this. If you build a house and you really need to get into the house, the bathroom works, the kitchen works, you can sleep in it. You don't have contractors in and out of your house, though you might during the day, you don't at night. And they got to finish the landscaping. So the landscaping might be considered a punch list item, or maybe they damaged a piece of your driveway or something like that. They'd fix it. So that requires, when we agree on the punch list with the contractors, we do a contract retention release. So we retain 5% of every invoice from the contractor. That gives us leverage over getting the punch list done. So what they do typically is they price the work on the punch list, and then we retain 125% of the value of that punch list. So we have not agreed on either one of the punch lists with either contractor yet, even though we have reached substantial completion. So the agreement on those punch lists for each one of these is imminent with the contractors. So working through those final details. Next slide, please. So with substantial completion and with achievement of the operation of the biological process at the Water Resources Center, the city hosted a completion event for folks who've been involved in the project all along, and then had a community open house. And I do know that plant staff has continued to have had open hosting people who are very interested in the Water Resources Center, the treatment technologies there. And also the most important milestone was that the city achieved the compliance with the state regulatory order that the facility be fully online and treating wastewater at the new Water Resources Center by February 28th of 2023. So we held the completion event about 5 days before the TSO compliance date. So a very good day for the community. So any questions on the completion of major construction before I move on?
It looks like Anvil has moved out. Does that mean that the city maintenance crews are now maintaining all of the right-of-way and properties that are now part of the new sewer conveyance system?
That is correct.
I walked by Pump Station B on my way here, and I noticed there's a lot of available parking in front of it. Are you gonna put some signs up there that say no parking or private property? Or
that is a great question. We will definitely take that under consideration with Public Works, and that's it. That's a good comment.
Thanks.
Any other questions on the completion of major construction on the two components of the program? Okay, with that, I'll present the WRF quarterly report update, a bit of it, and then I'll turn it over to my colleague Dan Heimel with Confluence Engineering, because the program is now turning its attention to the recycled water facilities. Not that we haven't been paying attention to it, but that is going to be the primary conversation that moves forward on the program from this point forward. So we submitted the quarterly report to the city on May 11th. Total spending through the third quarter of fiscal year 2023 is approximately 133.1 million against an adopted budget of 160 million for the entire program. And as we acknowledge each time, the prior WRF subcommittee worked closely with former council member Heller and former Mayor Heading to streamline the report, make it easier to understand, and thankfully for us and for city staff, easier to produce. So that was a very we like the report as we have it now. It's much easier to review, much easier to write, and much easier to produce. So next slide, please. So as I said, program schedule overview. I'll touch on this very briefly, and then I'll turn it over to Dan Heimel. The schedule, and apologies for the small nature of this. At a high level, the red bars represent projects that are or activities are on the critical path. The only remaining activity for the Water Resources Center is the required Division of Drinking Water testing of the advanced water purification facility. That is the last step of the treatment process on what we call the drinking water component, or I call the drinking water component, and the first step in the recycled water facility. So that testing remains to be completed. There's a 4-phase required test from the Division of Drinking Water, and 2 of the phases have been complete, and the 3rd and 4th phases, the report has been submitted and the plan has been submitted to DDW, or it's about ready to be submitted to DDW, and that's the Division of Drinking Water, the State Division of Drinking Water. And then that testing will take place as soon as the city hears back and the team hears back from Division of Drinking Water on that. Our aim would be that we would complete it in the next month or so, but that really depends on the Division of Drinking Water. So next slide, Mr. Heimel.
I just want to jump in quick. Mr. Amico was correct. We do have a special meeting on Wednesday, the 24th, and that is when the WRF items will be heard by City Council.
Yeah, members of the PWEB. Yeah, just brief update on the recycled water program. So in Q3, we completed the extended injection test. We've probably mentioned this before, but we actually wrapped that up at the beginning of this year. And then that's when the real work started. Now that we had the injection well, we had the injection test, we ran that test for over a month, we collected the data, and now the HydroGeo team really has taken that data and dug into. They've updated the groundwater model. They're evaluating injection well locations, injection rates, extraction rates, travel times, They're also looking at geochemical water analysis to make sure that when we put this new water into the basin, that we don't have any unintended consequences or geochemical interactions. So that's what the team has been working on, mainly on the hydrogeo side. All that's going to culminate into what we've been referring to as the basis of the design report. And that's really the plan for the IPR program, where the wells could be located, how much they're going to inject, how much could be extracted, what water supply benefit that's going to provide the city. The way that we're approaching it right now is that we're developing the plan for the full build out of that program at some future date. I mean, the city doesn't even have the full wastewater available to it right now that it will have in a full build out scenario. So we want to plan for the future, but then we want to look to implement a near term, smaller phase of that project that meets the city's needs for what it has now. Demands are lower right now, wastewater flows are lower right now, but there still are water supply needs, as we saw in the recent historic drought from 2020 to 2022. So that's kind of a preview of what's coming. The basis of design report is being reviewed by city staff, the project management team, and is actually undergoing a peer review by a third-party hydrogeologist so that we can get, the best available minds that we have looking at this and providing the best recommendations for the city. When that report is ready to come to the PWAB and the council, which we're currently anticipating in August, then we can provide you with the details of what the IPR program could look like, both in a full build out scenario and potentially what options the city would have for the near term implementation of that program. So if we go to the next slide, it's just a zoomed in version of the recycled water schedule piece of what Paul showed earlier. But yeah, it just highlights that really our efforts right now are focused around the hydrogeo and then the design and then moving into construction in 2024 is the current schedule. Do we want to pause for questions on the quarterly report?
We actually do. Yeah. If you all have.
I didn't have a question. I was just asking if you're finished. Are you finished?
I am, but this might be a good point to pause for questions if there are any.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So when the recycled water facility is complete, albeit not at its full build out, will that be complete in the sense of water coming from those wells and actually ending up coming out of somebody's faucet in a resident in Morro Bay, or is there that what the end result will be? Or is there still other kinds of infrastructure that would actually get the water to the last mile to homes and businesses?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding the question correctly, when you say the water facility is complete, I think you're referring to what Paul was saying with the last step at the Water Resources Center with the Division of Drinking Water. Yes, that is a critical milestone for the project, but that is not the point at which water will be injected into the basin. At this point, the infrastructure that we have for the injection is only one well. It's not connected to the recycled water pipelines, and it's not equipped with the mechanical equipment to operate as an injection well. It's a hole in the ground, but it's a critical, important hole in the ground because we were able to do the injection test using potable water. So the steps ahead of us are the design of that injection system, the construction of the additional wells, the equipping of those wells, and then the installation of the pipelines to feed the water from the pipeline. And I should say that a large length of the pipeline to feed those wells is constructed all the way to the bike path, but it hasn't been run the last bit to the injection well. Is that?
I'm not forgive me for my ignorance because I'm sort of new to this. In the simplest terms, when what you've outlined now as the short-term, near-term goals, okay, that won't actually take water from the injection wells and take it back to the reclamation plant and ultimately get it to a house for use. Is that correct?
When I refer to the near-term implementation strategy, I am referring to that full, or not, full is not the right term, but taking water from the Water Resources Center, treating it through the advanced treatment process, conveying it to an injection well, injecting it into the groundwater basin, and then extracting it through the city's existing potable water extraction wells, running it through the brackish water RO facility, and then serving it to a customer. The difference is the near-term implementation plan could have 2, 4, 5 wells, whereas a build-out scenario could have more additional wells to accommodate more flow. Sorry for the misunderstanding.
Anything further? No, not at this time.
Chair, I'd like to ask for any input from the PWAB on the Wharf Quarterly Report.
Is that complete the entire presentation or are there multiple components?
The next 3 slides discuss amendments that we're going to be taking to council next week.
Okay,
Which are not part of the Wharf Quarterly Report.
Correct.
gotcha. Okay. Any comments or recommendations from the board?
I wanted to compliment you guys on this report in that I really appreciate the narratives, which were a little bit longer, and I think any reasonable person could understand and conclude that those were, reasonable requests, et cetera, et cetera. So
Thank you. Thank you. We have a great team that works on this, and I'm just the last mile, as you said, and I do the review and then I send it and I get to answer all the questions. So.
Okay.
Okay. So that in concluding the Wharf Quarterly, we're going to move into 2 somewhat dense slides here. Well, the first one is a bit dense, and then the second one is a little more streamlined. Anvil Builders, who's the pipeline contractor, pipeline and pump station contractor, as Member Nava had noted, they've moved out of town. They actually moved out a couple weeks ago and completely demobilized. And so we are currently, we've evaluated a lot of change orders here at the end, potential change orders here at the end of the project. And we are moving forward recommending to council, I wish I could remember the number of change orders and PCOs that we have here, but it's quite a few. We did get a question, or we've gotten questions in the past from both the WRF subcommittee and then other community members about the number of change orders and the size, the size of this amendment. Yes, there are a lot. And I can't, our team works really hard and we worked very closely with Anvil, and it's not unusual to have a lot of change orders at the end of a job to process a lot of changes. The big push at the end is always to get the project done. We had an unfortunate circumstance where Anvil's project manager was out on medical leave for about a month. So we lost some time with that. And then it takes some time to get through the change orders as well. We do a lot of negotiation with Anvil. This does not represent the full amount of what they asked for, but we review each of these in detail, and we have a lot of discussion with them on particularly the larger ones, but even sometimes on the smaller ones. I always like to say sometimes it's hard to bring a $1,700 item forward to council, but it is real. I mean, it's extra work that they did. So I'll do my best to hit this in enough detail for folks to understand. But if you have any questions, please stop me at any time, and I'm glad to answer any detailed questions you might have on them. The first PCO, bike path joint trench waterline redesign. So when we first started the project, we didn't have the full easement that the bike path occupies now. We had to move forward into bidding. And then, as you all know, the city and Vistra Energy engaged in a lengthy discussion about the easements, and so we got the easements right around the time that we issued notice to proceed to Anvil for the pipelines. What that allowed us to do was to give them more space to build the pipelines. We'd always wanted to have that easement, but then through that process, Vistra didn't immediately want to grant that easement. PG&E, which was much easier. This is for landscape design. We have a 50% landscape design right now that has been prepared by Firma Consultants. We asked Anvil to bring them on to do that so that we could get that process started, because we wanted to understand what would Anvil be responsible for doing. In this particular case, we took it to 50%, and then as we move forward with the recycled water facilities, we concluded that the best path forward would be to leave a lane with on the west side of the bike path easement for future injection well construction. And so we didn't take that past 50% and ask Anvil to do anything beyond what was in their contract, because we wanted to give the community an opportunity to weigh in on that bike path landscape plan ultimately, and then to do the full restoration in the future once the bike path, once the injection wells were constructed, because we didn't want to put in landscaping and then tear it out at a later date. So this is for the 50% design. This was for Firma Consultants for that 50% design. The next one, paving limit revisions. I think everyone in the community did see that that Anvil repaved Quintana between the roundabout and La Loma. That road did not hold up well under construction. It was not in great shape when we started construction, and it didn't hold up very well. So the lion's share of the cost for this paving limit revisions change order was for that north side of Quintana, and then other revisions to make the road more rideable for this. The original estimate that we worked with Anvil on was around $320,000 for that extra work. But as paving goes, sometimes when they're out paving, you got to paint new limits. You got a big operation that's got a big, expensive operation, and so those limits were adjusted both during the construction day and then the days leading up to that. There were some additional paving as well, and it wasn't just 320. So their estimate or their actual paving quantity that they placed was about $390,000 that's being recommended now. There was some additional tonnage overrun, more asphalt was laid down. I've challenged them on that. Right now, we're still in discussions with them. So we may end up doing something with that in the future, but for right now, that additional amount had been set aside. There is about 55,000 of this is for lift station 2 paving. That's the Vistra easement. Interestingly enough, when that easement negotiation was ongoing and then the design plans, paving was omitted from the scope of work for final paving. That pavement was not in good shape, and so we did dispute that we should actually do anything in there because Vistra isn't actually using that property, but Vistra insisted then that we restore it to existing, which you can't put back bad pavement, so you got to put down new pavement. And then the last one was during paving, about $29,000, $28,000 of this paving was done in February after a pretty long period of wet weather in January, and Kings Avenue just ran with underground water down into that subgrade at Kings and Quintana, and they had to dig out about 4 feet of soil in that area and recompact with aggregate base to get that stable so that we could put pavement down on it. So that was an unfortunate, unforeseen that we had while we were paving. So the next one, 52.2, is for the monitoring at the pipe bridge in case there's an overflow there. And during construction, the city decided to not use a wire back to pump station A, but to use a solar array and I believe it's wireless in this. So that was a change that resulted in what we believe is going to be a more reliable communication system for any issues at the pipe bridge. And so that was about $30,000, just shy of that. Fiber optic design revisions and upgrades. The conveyance facilities includes a fiber optic cable that goes from pump station A to B up to the Water Resources Center, because historically the city had used the old treatment plant as the hub for all communications. During design, this was the actual scope of the fiber optic communication system was ill-defined at the time because the full system hadn't been done. The Water Resources Center, because it was design build, that wasn't fully flushed out. And so we always knew that there would be a change order for that additional work. I believe their pricing was quite a bit higher than this, but we negotiated this down to more what we believe is a little bit more reasonable for around $135,000. I think their initial estimate was, their initial ask was around $200,000 for this, but we didn't feel that that was appropriate because there was other work they were doing on contract. 64, 65, 67. All 3 of those were unforeseen conditions due to poor mapping of utilities in the area. And then in the case of the big one, 65, when they began excavating for the new junction structure at Pump Station A, it was just not going to fit because of some underground other utility conflicts. And so that structure had to be completely redesigned and reconstructed. This amount does reflect a credit from the old structure, and then this is all for the new work. So as you can tell, I don't have the credit right in front of me, but it was this was quite a deep structure and in high groundwater, pretty challenging construction, and it went from a precast structure into a cast in place. So there was a lot of labor associated with this. Number 69, tie in the lines at the Water Resources Center. Anvil had the responsibility to make the final tie-in at the plant, and they spent several days trying to get water to quit dripping out of that HDPE, high density polyethylene pipe. Has to be completely dry when you fuse it. And so we had to work with Feelance Black and Veatch on getting some valves closed. They needed to go figure out why the water was dripping, so they had to remobilize to the site a number of different times to make this happen. Number 71, I think we've talked a couple quarterly reports ago, or maybe at the last quarterly report, that we had to restart the startup of the Water Resources Center after it had started up. And so Anvil incurred costs to actually put the plug back in the sewer, in the diversion structure, and do some considerable work around that time to get flow sent back to the old treatment plant. And then there was some work to undo that later on and had to come back in. Guide rail modifications at the wet wells. It's a change to the pump station wet wells and the hatch size that was there. The hatches were not actually big enough to get the pumps in the way that it was supposed to be designed, so they had to modify the guide rails. This was a design clarification during construction. And then 80, I know I'm going through these really quick, but 82.2, similar to paving, the limits of construction for sidewalks and other flat work, what we call flat work, they just put more quantity of paving down, more quantity down than was shown on the plans. I'll note that there's actually an additional, I believe, $40,000 that we disputed from Anvil that they were trying to, they're attempting to get the city to pay for, but we believe is due to their some carelessness in some cases, and they damaged sidewalk and other concrete structures outside of the limits of construction. So this doesn't represent the entire amount of what they asked for. Caltrans right-of-way restoration costs. This was associated with the work that was done in the shoulder along the bike path. The reason it's disputed is because we believe there was a piece of it that should have been included in the original contract. So this doesn't represent the full amount that they've asked for, but we believe is a fair split of that work. 86, we had extra PVC pipe, so they moved it up to the Water Resources Center. Fencing modifications, 89.1. That's similar to the additional flat work and additional paving. Again, not they ended up replacing more fence than was shown on the plan. So this is a quantity, also a quantity overrun in that it was just more quantity of fence. And then this also included some additional decorative fence down at Pump Station A, went a little further with that fence rather than transitioning to chain link, just so it looked better. Number 90 is it's kind of hard to explain. It has to do with the pump control systems, and when the power voltage isn't constant and steady at Pump Station A during inclement weather. So those VFD stands for variable frequency drive. Those are very sensitive to those power drops. So between the designer and Anvil, they determined that they needed to install some additional equipment to smooth that power out and make sure that the city staff knew they were getting a lot of false alarms. So we had to correct that situation. The next one, 94. This was actually a one that the city. I was very impressed with Anvil that they stepped up and did this during the second round of extreme wet weather. The city asked Anvil to provide an excavator and a standby operator to help clear debris out of Morrow Creek down off Main Street at the Main Street Bridge, and they jumped, and within less than 24 hours, they had a guy in an excavator sitting down there waiting to pull trees out of the creek. And that's all they're asking for. This is a simple pass through of the guy's standby. The guy is a local, he was local, the operator. So this is for the excavator, the mobilization, the excavator, the site, and then I think the guy came out there a couple times.
He did, and he did an excellent job.
So I was very impressed that he was able to do that. I wondered if he grabbed a tree, what he was going to do with it after he got it. But and so then the last one, 96, fiber optic box at the entrance to the Water Resources Center. They just put it at they installed it. There was a lot of elevation changes at the entrance to the Water Resources Center and what happened there. And so about $5,000 just to raise that box up to finished grade after that had been paved. So, and then the last one, we descoped a storm drain relocation at their yard at the roundabout. So we're going to get a credit back on the contract for about $207,000 for not installing that storm drain. I know that was a lot to cover. We had a lot. This does not represent everything that they asked for here at the end. So there may be a few. They're continuing to send information on a couple that didn't make this list. There are 3 additional ones that we've received information on that we believe they may be entitled to. So we're still evaluating that, and they may end up coming shown back up and getting approved on the amendment.
Thank you, Paul. I just want to kind of repeat that to make sure it's understood. There are 1 or 2, or maybe 3 change orders that may go to council without coming through PWEP first, just because of the timeliness of the issue. These are also wrapped up in negotiations that we're currently engaged with Anvil on to come up with a final settlement. And so the reason that they wouldn't come back to PWEP potentially is if we feel it might jeopardize our negotiating position with regard to the global negotiation.
Is there currently any concern that the contingencies won't be enough to handle these upcoming changes?
You mean the overall program contingency? We're going to be presenting the budget, and we've done some reshuffling of budget to cover anything beyond this. There's headspace in the overall budget to be able to absorb that.
Any other questions from the board?
I was confused when I thought I.
It's a unit price bid. It was a unit price bid, right? With a lot of bid items. We have a lot of bid items for them. So and some of the trick on a unit price project like this is depending on the quantity overrun. And one of the other things that I would compliment Anvil on is, they really hung in there and they stuck it out and they got this job done. It was very, very tough for them. I think there were times they may have been a little, they were very challenged by the construction. This is not an easy project. And they're actually entitled to revisit those unit prices if the quantities get more than 25% of the bid quantity. So in some cases, in most of the cases, I believe they held their unit price on that. And so we had a lot of tough negotiations with them, and they stepped up in many ways to hold their pricing.
Okay, thank you for the presentation.
There's one more slide. We have Feelance Black and Veatch. I know. I'll try to go a little faster on this. There's not as many. Okay, so Amendment 9 for Feelance Black and Veatch. This is a design build agreement, with design build arrangement different than Anvil, which is a unit price bid. This represents an increase of what they call their guaranteed maximum price for the scope of work that's currently in their contract of $409,000. So these 7 PCOs that we've been tracking, many of these, the way that the design build arrangement is structured is if we have an approval process through staff and we agree on what the scope of work is, and many of these represent work that FBV has already completed as part of this. They've notified us that they were entitled to a GMP increase. We would agree with that. And then this represents their actual cost versus the original guaranteed maximum price structure, which is they give us a price and then and they're incentivized through the structure to be more efficient to try to bring it in under that guaranteed maximum price. There's a provision in the contract that the city and FBV split the savings if they bring in the project under the GMP. They are entitled to GMP increase, guaranteed maximum price on these, and these represent the actual pricing. There are a few more PCOs that we have not authorized them to do yet because we're nearing the end of the job. And we want to take those through a more robust approval process through the city than this, because again, we're right at the end of the job. And increasing the GMP oftentimes just means that they get a little more breathing room to bring it in under and get those shared savings achieved. So, yes.
I need that explained. So this 70, the 71,567, was that the guaranteed maximum price? Or is that what he brought it in under and then the maximum price was more and you're splitting the difference?
So this isn't a great example.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Because I'll tell about that one in a minute. Did you want to?
I'm going to take a stab at that. And Paul, if you don't agree with my characterization, please chime in. But the guaranteed maximum price is set based on scope items. When additional scope comes in, the contractor is entitled to raise that guaranteed maximum price. So in this case, the CMMS software, the scope changed, the city requested more. Therefore, it didn't work against the guaranteed maximum price because we're asking for new things. So the GMP goes up. Does that answer your question?
So the GMP went up by $71,000.
Yes,
particular item.
for that item,
Okay, thank
because it wasn't contemplated in the original GMP.
Right.
you. Okay, thank you.
So the in this particular CMMS stands for Computerized Maintenance Management System. This tracks all the city's preventive maintenance, whether it's routine on a time-based or runtime based, like so a pump, so many 100 hours, it then automatically sends the operations staff a work order. It says, hey, you need to go maintain this pump. FBV proposed a certain software package way back in design. A different software package was selected. They showed us their pricing. They said that they originally budgeted X amount of dollars for it. And this was this new package cost more. I will say for this particular item, we negotiated an agreement with them because the contract language was not necessarily favorable to them in this. But they did show us that they incurred additional cost for selecting the package or buying the package that the city selected and then paying the software maintenance. They actually have come to us and claimed additional labor to deal with this package because they've never used it before, and we rejected that. So they're going to eat some labor on this because you said you were going to provide one. Regardless of what that means, you guys are experts, you can figure this out, and that is a sunk cost. So in this case, they asked for more GMP to cover their inability to navigate through this process with a package that was different than the one that they selected. But their contract said they were to provide one. So they demonstrated that the package that they wanted to put was less expensive, but I came back and said, well, I'm sorry about your luck. That was your risk. You took that risk. We're not increasing the GMP just so you can cash in on your labor in this particular case. So that's sort of how the negotiations work. There's always give and take. In some of these, we're in a little weaker position than others. That one, but they have noticed that they could potentially claim it again in the future. So we may end up fighting about it again, but for now, this is the price we got. The cost of this was higher. 120, PCO 120, we actually held them up by 7 days. The pump stations and pipelines were not ready when we said they were going to be, so they were entitled to additional cost to haul sludge and have people running around keeping the plant alive while we waited. 134 and 125 are two additional instruments that this one was the 134 is required for the testing, and that was not included in their original scope, so they are entitled to that one. 125 is an interesting one. We're still in debate on whether or not they're actually entitled to this, but we included it now, and we're still going to talk to them. We may end up, depending on where we land on that, we end up pulling that one off of council, but for now, it's not their design intent. They achieved this particular thing, which is to determine whether there's chlorine actually disinfecting the wastewater before it leaves the plant. The city staff is saying the only way that they can really understand whether there's chlorine is to have an analyzer. FBV had a different design approach, and we're in discussions right now on, we agree that that particular thing wasn't in their scope of work, but we disagree on whether their approach is actually an effective way to do it. So this one may end up coming off before we go to council. This is how these things kind of go. 128, they are entitled to material price escalation within the DB agreement. Unfortunately for Anvil, they're not, but the DB agreement does allow for material price escalation for pandemics. Oh, Granite is the paving contractor. Granite Construction, yeah. I don't do these names. Our construction manager does, and sometimes he puts pretty cryptic names in here. And so additional paving at the Water Resources Center entrance, we had them do some additional water line work and the paving limits changed. So we had to pay them for that. And then 133, new Rancher Gate. I don't know the specifics on this, but there's a gate for the adjacent property owner that needed to be added that wasn't shown on the plans. So that was an ask for the city. We do have one more slide on one additional contract amendment. Any questions on Felons Black and Veatch before we do that? Okay, and then last slide. Consultant contract amendments, Cogstone Resource Management Group, they've been doing the Native American monitoring. They incurred additional cost for additional dig days from Anvil. So this closes them out, additional $31,000 for actual costs incurred over and above what their original scope was. So this will close out Cogstone because we're completely done with digging. So this will be it for them. Thanks for hanging in there on that. I know it's a lot of detail.
All right, so now the presentation's finished.
No.
All right. We have any, it sounds like we have a couple questions still?
Does Cogstone present a report at the end of the project
Yes.
for the city's records, or?
So those are filed with the State Historic Preservation Office, and they're also filed with EPA.
Okay.
This monitoring is required by the programmatic agreement between EPA and the State Historic Preservation Office, of which the city is a signatory, but they're not actually party to the agreement. It has to do with the WIFIA funding, the EPA funding. And so Far Western, for the folks that have done a lot of the other Native American investigation and cultural resource investigation, they actually prepare the report on an annual basis on behalf of the city. So Cogstone submits it to them. They submit it to EPA. So we did one in January, I believe. And then we'll do another one next January as the program proceeds.
Thanks.
So am I correct? By my calculation, there's about $27 million left in the overall cost of 160 million. Is that correct?
There's the actual cost of work performed is 133. That would be 27 more of projected spending on the on budgeted spending, but that doesn't mean that I mean, our aim always is to bring things in under budget.
Well, so that was if the river don't rise, are we optimistic that when it's all said and done, we'll be under that figure?
Yeah, I mean, that's, we're doing our best.
Thank you.
How much is spent so far? 132 million?
133.1
And-
as of the end of March.
And that includes the injection wells, all the work that's been doing on that.
Yep, that's
So
every, yeah.
what's left to do with all that can be done for less than 27 million?
So I can't speak, Mr. Heimel has been managing and doing the water, the recycled water facilities budget. As of the end of March, we had not received, I think as of the end of March, we had received invoices from FBV through December. And then we're, generally a couple months behind on invoicing from Anvil as well. So I do know that, Anvil's invoices were, $600,000 a month. And then FBV around the same rate. And so we always, like I said, it's always kind of strange because we see things a few months later.
Right.
So I don't have off the top of my head, I did a mid-year budget and I don't recall specifically how much was remaining in each one of those contracts to be spent. But we can certainly follow.
Oh, so, okay. So you might have more than 27 million left to spend.
Less than 27 million.
Less.
Yes, because we have those invoices that would reflect expenditures through the end of March and their invoicing may be a couple months behind.
And again, the last phase of this can be done for less than that.
I would refrain from speculating on that.
Well, I'm,
I,
he's trying to stay under budget. so-
I mean, we always try to stay under budget. This is a very complex project with many moving parts. What Project Manager Heimel brought up earlier was that the city would have an option potentially to have a phased approach to the IPR portion of the project, which means that we could satisfy the requirements of our regulators by doing a smaller number of wells with, a future build out dependent on need. And so, there's a valid question. Well, what's the project? Is it all the phases, or is it maybe the one that you can get away with? So those are questions that haven't been decided on by the city council yet. They haven't even been brought to the city council yet. So we're always looking for ways to save money and really only do what's needed. If the question is, are we going to be under budget? My answer would be, I don't know. There are some indicators that show preliminarily that we could be, but there's also a lot of unknowns yet left with the project. It's a good question.
Why don't we go ahead and move on to public comment? And then if the board wishes to have any additional discussion, we can do that afterward. Do we have anyone in the audience that would like to comment?
Does that do it? Thank you. Thank you. And I'm not sure I understand all of what was going on, but a little bit. And part of it's the last discussion here about whether we have money left over or not. And would seem to me that we don't, because we haven't finished the IPR part. And we don't even know how much that's going to cost. We don't know how many wells we're going to dig. And so I would think that we're not going to. I just want to put that out there. And then the whole thing about Cogstone being done, if we're not finished digging wells, don't we need to have Cogstone around to know where the new well? So this is a question. If we're digging more wells, don't we need Cogstone there to supervise when those wells are dug? And that's a question. Let's see. Other than some disagreement about what Black and Veatch should be paying for and what we should be paying for is probably irrelevant here. That would probably go to city council. But it seems to me the final comment for me might be that, as we were talking about, that these are the mechanical things that have yet to be put in place till we get that water to the house from all that we've done. There's still state requirements. There's still testing, even though that one test was done, it may need to be redone because of it was using potable water and not potable water. Was it done for a long enough period of time or not? Because there's other regulations. So it seems to me that maybe we've discussed the mechanics of it, but there's other rules that are involved that will continue to delay the IPR.
Thank you. Do we have anyone online that would like to comment? No. Okay. Would the board like to have any additional discussion or provide any other input?
Can you address Betty's remarks? They're somewhat general, but whatever you can say about them.
Sure. On Cogstone, so Cogstone's scope of work was to provide Native American monitoring for the conveyance facilities only. So depending on where the injection wells end up, there will be an additional investigation from Far Western, and they still have money remaining in their budget to map out and determine whether additional monitoring would be needed depending on where that pipeline goes. So Cogstone in particular was selected for a very specific scope of work, and they've satisfied that scope of work. Depending on where the pipelines go and what Far Western finds, additional monitoring may be needed or not. So that remains to be seen. And then what was the second question? I don't. Okay.
there's nothing additional, I believe that will conclude that agenda item. Is that correct?
Yes, if there's any general comments that PWAB members would like us to pass along to the city council next week at their meeting, that would be helpful. If not, my comment in the staff report will be something like that the PWAB reviewed the change orders, amendments in the Wharf Quarterly Report and didn't provide comment. It's not a negative thing, just satisfied with the explanations that staff gave.
Well, personally, I don't have any additional comments. Looks like we're all commented out
Okay.
for today. We thank you for the presentation, though. It was helpful. I wanted to clarify one quick thing before we adjourn. Our next regular meeting will be coming up June 21st, Wednesday. And that will be back at the Veterans Hall, is that correct? And then also, Greg, I thought I heard you mention something about a special meeting, and I just wanted to clarify whether there was, you might have meant the council, but I just wanted to make sure.
Yes, so to your first question, yes, the next regular meeting will be held on Wednesday, June 21st at 5:30 at the Vets Hall. And for clarification, yes, I was talking about the city council special meeting. City council will have 2 meetings next week, one regular meeting where there'll be a budget hearing on the operating budget on Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, they'll hear, as a special meeting, they'll hear the capital budget. And part of that presentation will include some of the items that were brought to the PWAP today about the wharf project.
Okay, with that, then let's adjourn. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.